On these benches, the crossbenches, we are privileged to have colleagues who possess an extraordinary array of talent, experience, intellect, knowledge of government, of law, and of international affairs. Whether they are inclined towards Leave, Remain, or any shade in between, they are more concerned and worried about our current state of uncertainty and national embarrassment than at any point in their collective memories. Our dilemma was outlined in painful clarity by our ex-ambassador to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, in his speech at Liverpool University last month. I commend it to all of your lordships with a taste for the kind of enervating entertainment offered by my noble friend Lord Lisvane to his maiden aunts. It is like a bucket of powerful paint stripper being applied to a canvas by a highly skilled diplomatic artist. What is depicted on the canvas is nearer to a Francis Bacon triptych than to the Monarch of the Glen. Sir Ivan depicts our fundamental misreading of how the EU operates and the weakness of our negotiating approach. He also inflicts richly deserved pain on so many of us. I quote, "Both fervent leavers and fervent remainers, as well as Number 10, seem to me now to seek to delegitimise, a priori, every version of the world they don't support." Where do we go from here, my lords, assuming, as seems very likely, that tomorrow's vote in another place rejects the Prime Minister's deal? Do we relinquish what vestiges of control we still possess and accept the glorious defeat offered by departing without any deal at all? My lords, I've been doing my homework and I looked at all of the speakers in the 2 days of last week's debate, and of the 19 Conservative peers who spoke in that debate, 50% are in favour of no deal, and only 24% are in favour of the deal on offer. We live in strange times, my lord. Or do we, and I refer primarily to our elected representatives in the other place, wrest back control from the embarrassingly inept hands of Her Majesty's government and from its unworthy challenger, the equally inept and opaque Labour leadership? Last Wednesday evening, my inner masochist turned on the television, and I found myself listening, much to my surprise, to a voice of sanity. It came from a fellow crossbencher and ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, my noble and right reverend friend, Lord Williams of Oystermouth. Apart from being reminded that he possesses a set of eyebrows rivalled on the crossbenches only by my noble friend Lord Lisvane, I was struck by the way in which he listened and thought carefully before any of his responses to a series of difficult questions about our current impasse. No sound bites, no pre-rehearsed mantras, no entrenched and intractable points of view, just thoughtful, sensitively phrased, and carefully considered responses that acknowledge the difficult decisions that we face. And I found myself agreeing with his reluctant but carefully thought through conclusion that we should follow the advice last Thursday of my noble friend Lord Armstrong of Ilminster and revoke and withdraw Article 50. We must acknowledge that swallowing our pride and admitting our failure to have defined, negotiated, and then enacted a departure from the EU which is acceptable to a majority of our elected representatives requires us to return to the drawing board. No deal will not do. Extending Article 50 will not do. It will simply create yet another deadline and allow us once again to kick the can temporarily down the road. No more, my lords. Last month I reminded your lordships of the surreal but uncomfortably pertinent Monty Python scene in which the characters debate their dislike of Rome, for which read the EU, whilst having to acknowledge a longer and longer list of the many benefits it has brought. Today I'm reminded of the agonised words of the character played by John Cleese in the film A Fish Called Wanda. I quote, "Do you have any idea what it's like being English?" With apologies to Scots, Welsh and Irish noble lords. "Being so correct all of the time, being so stifled by this dread of doing the wrong thing. We are all terrified of embarrassment." End of quotes. My lords, I think we have embarrassed ourselves enough, and our many friends abroad. Let us stop the clock, recover our mental faculties, nurse our emotional dissonance, and seek a way forward that does not preclude any eventual outcome, and which prioritises understanding and acting quickly to remedy the deep economic and social divisions which the last 2.5 years have laid bare. Let us cease and desist and face up to our failures and to our responsibilities.
I'm delighted to follow the noble Lord Russell of Liverpool. May I declare my interests? I practised European law in Brussels. I both advised MEPs in the European Parliament and was elected as an MEP for 10 years. I served 18 years as a Member of Parliament, 5 years of which I chaired the EFRA committee. Let us consider today, what did people vote for in the referendum? In my view, put most simply, they wanted to remain in the common market, but not a political union. They wanted to reduce immigration, and they wanted to take back control. In terms of immigration, not all immigration is bad. We need to differentiate the needs for the economy. We need to recognise the needs of health, social care, food, farming and the hospitality industry. We need to recognise that the back-breaking work like fruit picking, vegetable growing and the horticultural industry will no longer be done by students and people already living in this country. We need to have access to a reliable source of skilled and unskilled labour for farmers who otherwise will be held back by the lack of access to a workforce. Then let us look at what our trading relations will be post-Brexit with both the EU and third countries. Trading in agricultural produce have huge implications for food and farming. We must legislate for the same high standards of health, welfare and hygiene on leaving the European Union as we currently enjoy. We must recognise the implications of chlorine-rinsed chicken, hormone-produced beef from the US, as well as substandard foods from Brazil and Argentina, potentially will affect both consumers and home producers negatively alike. There will be an enhanced role for the Food Standards Agency post-Brexit, as that agency will have to check all imports from the EU as well as from third countries. We must be very clear. The implications of leaving with no deal means leaving on World Trade Organization most favoured nation rules. We will have to treat all countries the same so we can show no preferential treatment in exports or imports. But the most favoured nation, i.e. must deliver equal treatment to all countries on the principle of non-discrimination. So we cannot simply treat our erstwhile EU partners more favourably than any other trading nations in the circumstances of a no deal. What a pity that the ardent proponents of a no deal do not explain that in such stark terms, particularly the implications for the Irish border, explained so eloquently and so simply by Lord Mackay of Clashfern. Potential tariffs on livestock could reach 40% on both, particularly beef and lamb. That in itself is the greatest threat to hill farmers across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. These farmers that I grew up with and represented for a number of years play a key role in both feeding the nation and delivering the biodiversity of the countryside. They could never be replaced. The most drastic change we would see on leaving on World Trade Organization terms would be border checks on paperwork and the application of tariffs and non-tariff barriers. Let us consider for a moment nomenclatures. That means that we have to identify every item in every individual product. We have to describe it, we have to recognise and state the provenance and its content, and only then can we attach the appropriate tariff to the finished product. The impact is not just of tariffs, but non-tariff barriers and other regulations like paperwork. I remember when the 120 pages that used to be issued in the European Union were replaced by one page with 120 boxes. What actually changed? So these checks could result in delays at borders which could destroy perishable goods such as foodstuffs. In considering the options before us today, in my view, the Prime Minister's deal is preferable to crashing out without a deal, preferable to a second referendum, and preferable to a general election, which would most probably return a similar result that we have now, with no overall majority. In the long term, we should seek the closest possible relationship with the EU that delivers frictionless trade, such as enjoyed by countries who are currently members of the EEA and EFTA, leading to access of the single market, but with the added benefits of a customs union to be negotiated through a separate protocol. In the short term, I see no alternative if the Prime Minister loses the vote on no deal, but to apply for a short pause in Article 50. There is the issue arising of the elections to the European Parliament, but we could apply for observer status for those British MEPs, or at least some of them, currently serving in the European Parliament, who could then oversee the arrangements in those intervening months. A second referendum holds no attraction for me. Why repeat an exercise when the last one was so divisive, inconclusive, but resulted in the murder of an MP, Joe Cox? The final say has to rest with the House of Commons, with the democratically elected representatives of the people, and allow the House of Commons to vote on each of the options available. You simply cannot expect the electorate to enter into the minutiae of policy detail. What else would taking back control really mean other than restoring parliamentary democracy?
My Lords, I want to make 3 points. The first is that the reality is that the Prime Minister's deal is dead. The majority of MPs and probably a majority of your Lordship's House from all sides simply don't support it. In the country, both Leavers and Remainers are quixotically united in rejecting it. The PM's deal is definitely dead. My second point is that there is no real mandate for leaving the European Union. 17 million people voted leave, 16 million voted to remain, 13 million didn't vote at all. So the expressed will of the people, as the Brexiteers like to call the outcome of the referendum, was the expressed will of only 37% of the electorate. And the polls tell us that these figures are shifting further in the direction of Remain, particularly amongst those younger people eligible to vote for the first time, who are the very people who are going to inherit this mess. But it's not just a numbers game. All the political parties, with the one exception of the Liberal Democrats, are pretty radically split on the issue. Even the bishops have confessed, if that is what bishops are allowed to do today in the House, that they are split. The normal machinery of politics simply doesn't work where Brexit is concerned. Now, in any other walk of life, no sensible leader would attempt something as complex, heroic and contentious as unravelling 50 years of close partnership with no real mandate, no overwhelming support in the country, and with their party split and unable to offer support. It simply wouldn't happen. My third point is that if the PM's deal has no support, no deal is even more catastrophic and must be absolutely ruled out. It would be the equivalent of the closing moments of one of my favourite films, a road movie called Thelma and Louise, where the two main characters, when cornered by events in the law, drive spectacularly and with huge elan off a cliff. Now, driving off a cliff never has a good outcome. And let me give your Lordships just one example of the risks of a no-deal Brexit, which I don't think has been highlighted completely so far. Brexit is a pivotal challenge for the environment. 80% of our current environment law stems from the EU. A no-deal Brexit would sweep away the current effective systems of enforcement of environmental law, the existing rights of the public to environmental information, to public participation and to access to justice. With a no-deal Brexit, there's a real risk that the UK, as part of a desperate scramble to sign trade deals, would be pressurised into a post-Brexit bonfire of environmental standards. As the noble Lord Whitty outlined, the Government has promised a whole framework of primary and secondary legislation for the environment, but none of it can come into place quickly, if at all, under a no-deal Brexit. And this is simply one area that I have knowledge of where black holes open up under a no-deal. We must avoid a no-deal at all costs. So, my Lords, I believe your Lordship's House must be the voice of sanity. We should vote vigorously against the Prime Minister's deal. We should stop a no-deal Brexit. We must not be like Thelma and Louise, where we would head off a cliff intoning, "It's the will of the people." I would go further than our front bench. I would ask the other place to revoke Article 50 notification. Now, some say that resiling from a Brexit that looks highly unpalatable under closer examination and has proven in reality to be politically unachievable would destroy faith in the political system. My Lords, there is no faith in the political system. Many of those who voted to leave did so because they felt that politics hadn't delivered social and economic results for them, because they had already lost faith in the political system. The time has come for men and women of goodwill across the parties to abandon this Brexit, which will impact particularly on those who are poorer and less able to cope with its impacts, and focus on forging a national engagement and agreement in addressing the real issues of the day, of future prosperity, of economic and social inequalities, and of the safeguarding of peace.
Well done. It's a great pleasure to follow my titular neighbour, Baroness Young of Old Scone. As someone with no dietary requirements, in any cafe or restaurant menu, there is invariably for me more than one right answer. For the Brexit menu before us today, however, there is less than one right answer. Thus, I find myself in that same maze that the noble and learned Lord Hope of Craighead described in his speech of the 5th of December, and has been referred to many times in our 5 days. Other than accepting the deal on offer, I agree with him that there are the 3 ways out of the maze: no deal, go back to the people, or to seek to renegotiate. Having spent a career in assessing risk, I naturally look at each of these 3 routes through those spectacles. The EU Select Committee examined the no-deal option in exhaustive detail and published a report in December 2017. Our report was unanimous, and it concluded that the outlook following a no-deal Brexit was full of risk. I don't have time to develop the point which others have done in our 5 days of debate. The route looks to me, however, to represent an unacceptably high risk of significant economic damage, particularly so for the trading goods part of our economy. In saying that, I accept that there is a line of logic that suggests that mini-deals would be done in a no-deal situation to ameliorate matters, and this can and does reduce some risk, but I feel that I've taken account of that in reaching my conclusions. The second way out of the maze was to go back to the people. As a Scot, I'm a veteran of 2 recent referenda. They're deeply divisive of our community and fraught with bad behaviour on the part of the campaigns themselves and their supporters too. In the Scottish referendum, there was much low-level criminal damage, intimidation and dreadful cyber activity, to finger some only of the unsavoury elements. In the EU referendum, feelings also ran very high, with many families and friendships riven. The Most Reverend Primate, in his speech on the 5th of December, talked of the importance of healing, and last week spoke of the need for reconciliation. In both instances, the whole House agreed with him, and I fear that another referendum stands a substantial chance of seeing very considerable unrest and the opening and reopening of many awful wounds. Anna Soubry MP got a personal gypsy's warning of this, which reached the front page of the Times last week. In any event, I agree with the many noble lords who suggested that such a referendum is unlikely to settle the issue permanently. The third way out of the maze is to seek to renegotiate. The Select Committee visited Brussels for 2 days at the start of November, and immediately before the announcement of the potential deal. As ever, we met substantially all the various interlocutors, whom we've got to know through the process. The very strong impression I had was that both sides were at their limits, and that the appetite for further negotiations was very low. In addition, the apparatus that the EU negotiates through is very clunky. Behind Monsieur Barnier is a committee structure which involves all the EU 27. We sat for a lengthy meeting with that committee's secretariat and learnt through practical examples of the great difficulties and sheer length of time it takes to achieve consensus on even small issues among the EU 27. We are therefore, in my view, both out of negotiating time and negotiating appetite. And accordingly, I think there's a strong likelihood that an attempt at a substantial renegotiation will make little, if any, significant change and just push us towards no deal. During, however, that same Brussels trip, I was much encouraged by our lengthy visit to the Canadian Embassy. They told us how they were already making small, incremental and mutually beneficial changes to their brand new treaty, agreed only in 2017. We had a similar report from a very senior Swiss official in an informal meeting in London the following week. Both commented that concluding a treaty was not the end of the matter, but the start of a conversation. And I fear the backstop less than many because of these two sessions. Thus, at the start of December, I felt the correct route was to accept this pretty unpalatable deal. It represented the lowest risk to the UK, our fellow citizens' lives and jobs, and the 3.5 million EU citizens living among us. But the Prime Minister seems likely to face defeat tomorrow, and accordingly I will comment briefly on how one might conduct a renegotiation which stood some chance of succeeding. It seemed to me in early December, and still today, that there would have to be a strong body of agreement among MPs on the ask, and that ask must be simple. In cricket, or at least junior cricket, the wicketkeeper is covered by the backstop, and the backstop is covered by a long stop, a date after which the backstop would fall. I am sure a winning simple ask might be found in that thought. And in this, I am encouraging the Prime Minister to have another go following today's exchange of letters. I would also just say out of interest that most insurance policies that I've ever been involved in have a cancellation provisions. I would submit to the EU a serious point, that in a no-deal situation, the economy of the island of Ireland would have a very high risk of significant damage, and that would itself threaten the Good Friday arrangements. And accordingly, such a long stop was thus more consistent with the Good Friday arrangements. Going into any negotiation, however, is still jettisoning the bird in the hand. And from the menu with less than one right answer, I think we should take this deal.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow a very thoughtful speech from the Noble Earl. The Prime Minister claims there's no alternative to her deal. But there is. Not mine, not Jeremy Corbyn's, whatever that is. It's Donald Tusk's. The Canada-style free trade deal he offered in March and repeated in October. As he said, that is the only deal compatible with leaving the customs union and single market, as promised in the referendum and in the Conservative manifesto. It must cover the whole UK, which means replacing the backstop by a commitment by Ireland, the EU and UK that we will all retain an invisible Irish border, as we've all pledged to do if there is no withdrawal agreement. Under Article 24 of the WTO, if we agree such a deal in principle, we can continue to trade with zero tariffs after the 29th of March while fleshing out the details. To get such an agreement, we must be ready and be seen to be ready by the EU to leave on WTO terms. As Trade and Industry Secretary, I helped negotiate the WTO to provide a safe haven for trade, and I also implemented the Single Market Programme. I predicted that both would boost trade, wrongly in the case of the Single Market, to which our exports have grown by a miserable 18% over 25 years, but rightly for the WTO, since our exports to the rest of the world have grown by 72%. If we leave on WTO terms, there will be four obvious pluses. First, far from crashing out, we will be cashing in, as my noble friend Lord Hamilton predicted, I would say. We will keep 39 billion, and your Lordship's own committee concluded that Article 50 allows the UK to leave the EU without being liable for outstanding financial obligations. To show good faith, we should confidently submit the issue to international arbitration. Second, it would end corrosive uncertainty, economic and political, which would continue for over 2 more years under the PM's deal. Third, both sides will have to solve the Irish border by administrative measures without border posts, as they've promised if there is no deal. Mr Varadkar has said, in a no-deal scenario, we won't be installing a border between Northern Ireland, and everybody knows that. Mr Juncker reassured the Irish Parliament that if negotiations fail, the European Union will not impose a border, customs posts or any other kind of infrastructure on the frontier. And Britain has said it will not require any infrastructure at the border under any circumstances. We already tackle smuggling of tobacco, alcohol, red diesel and drugs without border checks, so the UK can certainly stop illicit trade in Dyson vacuum cleaners if our regulations deviate from those of the EU. Finally, once we all resolve the Irish border issue administratively, we can take up Tusk's offer of a free trade deal for the whole UK. Not one of the noble lords who've railed against no deal in these debates have addressed these benefits of a WTO Brexit, even to refute them. More remarkable, only 2 or 3 noble lords have spelt out specific concerns about a WTO Brexit. The others simply demonised it with a lexicon of lurid adjectives which were last deployed to warn against leaving the ERM, not joining the euro or the millennium bug. Let me address the specific concerns that a couple of noble lords have raised. The first was given by the noble Baroness of Smith of Basildon, opening the debate in December, who said, planes will be grounded. She was apparently unaware that on the 13th of November, the European Union Commission had already promised legislation allowing air carriers from the UK to fly over and to and from the EU, provided the UK reciprocated. The Commission also announced that hauliers will continue to get licences, that Airbus can export its wings, that the UK will be swiftly lifted as a safe country to allow, in the words of the EU, to allow entry of live animals and animal products from the UK, and more. The other very concrete concern came from the Right Reverend Prelate, the Archbishop of Canterbury. While temporal lords have been demonising a WTO Brexit with odium theologicum, it took a Lord Spiritual to bring us down to earth with the request for proof that it would not have a significant negative effect on people in his diocese, like when Operation Stack has been in force. Of course, it's impossible to prove a negative or that Operation Stack will never be necessary, regardless of Brexit. It's been invoked on 211 days over the last 18 years, though without any archiepiscopal moral censure of those responsible. But I can explain why Brexit should not add significantly to such delays. Firstly, HMRC expect roughly the same number of physical checks of vehicles at Dover as at present, because their checks are based on risk, notably of smuggling of tobacco, drugs and illegal immigrants, none of which will increase because of Brexit. Moreover, HMRC promised to prioritise flow over compliance. That means waving lorries through even if their declarations are incomplete. The concern has not been, in the past, has not been about Dover, but about Calais. But the good news brought to the Archbishop's attention by Lord Forsyth is that the chairman of Calais Port says they too will have no more checks than at present. They are determined and confident that traffic will flow freely, not to be nice to Britain, but to avoid losing trade to Zeebrugge, Rotterdam and Antwerp. They are installing 3 extra lorry lanes, an inspection post for animals away from the port, and a scanner for trains moving at 30 kilometres an hour. So Monsieur Puississeau was indignant that the British government was, quite unnecessarily in his view, hiring ferries to take trade away from his port to other ports. My lords, problems one prepares for rarely happen, as we discovered with the millennium bug. The government is now being rather coy about how advanced its own preparations are for leaving on WTO terms because it wants to frighten MPs into voting for its deal. But I am confident that if we leave on the 29th of March on WTO terms, events will be far closer to a damp squib than the apocalypse. That may disappoint some fanatical Remainers in this House, but they'll get over it.
Yeah. Last week, in this long-running crisis, Mr. Speaker Bercow made a ruling in the House of Commons which makes an already unpredictable situation even more unpredictable. And the long-running consequences of that ruling have yet to play out, because I can't see Parliament giving back the powers that they've just gained, and we might well see more cross-party deals if the negotiations on the political declaration continue, as I think they will, and I shall say more about that in a moment, over the next few years. This will not be quick. I also want to say, before I get on to that I am strongly opposed, as rather differently to most of my colleagues, to another referendum. For me, another referendum would be a failure, and it would probably, even at the end, as you did it as a desperation measure, still not solve the problem. The reason I am against another referendum is I think that it would probably produce a very similar result to the one we've already had. And the difficulty of this, and perhaps needs to be said very often in this place, because the majority of people here voted Remain and strongly support Remain. I voted Remain. I think it would have been better if we had stayed in. But I think it is a profoundly serious mistake, as Lord Skidelsky said, to assume that the other side of that argument is a weak argument. There are a lot of people on that side of the argument, on the Brexit side, who feel passionately that we must be out of the European Union. And they don't just feel it about immigration, they don't just feel it about bureaucrats or whatever, they feel it because there has been a long-running belief in Britain that we should join an economic market, not a political one. This goes back to the 1957 Rome Treaty of the ever closer union. The British people did not see a political need for that. The European continental countries did, and why? Because all of them in the last couple of hundred years have had their borders changed by force, have been defeated and occupied without exception, every one of them. So they see it as a peacekeeping mechanism, and they are right. Britain doesn't see it that way. The last time we had a war on our soil was 380 years ago, and it was a civil war. Perhaps we're running up for another one right now on the Brexit issue, I'm worried to say. So do not treat their arguments as trivial, and do not think they will change their view just because the economics of this look bad. The political side for them was very important, and they did see themselves, I would argue the majority of British people saw themselves joining an economic supermarket, not a superstate. And that makes the fundamental difference. If you got a similar result as you had before, we would be no better off than we are now. If the result was marginally the other way, and it was for Remain, and this point has already been made, so I needn't labour it, then there will be more people coming back for yet another referendum. Just look at the SNP's argument on this. They always want another referendum. They would have one a week until they won, and that will happen with both sides of the Brexit argument if we are not careful. And that's why I would see it as a last resort. It may have to happen if the House of Commons can't get on top of this and sort out an alternative. I also would be worried, incidentally, about what the question or questions would be and how quickly you could get that through the House of Commons, together with the approval of the Electoral Commission, who have to give their agreement to it. At the end of the day, Burke was right. Britain works best with representative democracy. Do not have referendums. And one thing I got us into this mess was a referendum where the Prime Minister of the day had not worked out what he would do if he didn't get the result that he wanted. And that brings me to the major point that I really want to make, which is this document, the political declaration, because I do see this as a long-term way forward. The political declaration, as many people have said, is fairly woolly. But yes, of course it's woolly. What it should have been is produced about 2 months after the referendum. Had it been produced just after the referendum, it would have been a negotiated document, and we would be in a rather better position, I would suggest, than we are at the moment.
Absolutely.
And if we can get to a situation, and I don't know whether we can or not, I make no predictions about it. I think the crisis is too serious and too unpredictable. But if we can get to a situation where we have a deal with the European Union, then we use the political declaration to build up that ever closer relationship which we need. It was Lord Skidelsky again who said in a speech which I agreed very largely with, that Europe needs to be, not just is, but needs to be travelling at more than one speed. So that those who are going for ever closer union continue to do so. I would like to see a development in the European continent of a single state, however it's defined, federal or whatever. I think it's necessary, and not least for defence and foreign policy issues, where if you look at it, it is daft that 450 million well-educated modern economies of Europe can't stand up to 150 people in Russia of a corrupt and despotic regime without the help of the United States. And the US will not be there forever. So although I don't want to see the end of NATO or the EU, bear in mind that what is happening in Europe is long-term. And we have to be part of it. We can't be right out of it, but right now we can't be right into it. So I do say that whatever happens in the House of Commons, and they've got to decide, not us, I think the issue at the end of the day is to use the political declaration to move things forward. And I say finally to the Minister on the front bench, I was delighted to see in that document, and indeed I think in the agreement, a recognition that we needed a close development between the two parliaments. The proposal that I made in this House about 2 years ago, just after the referendum. And I say to him, if he will stand up and say that we will do that and we'll get on with it as soon as we've got this immediate situation under the control, then I tell him I'll buy him a drink.
Very good. Very good.
I've spoken before in this House on the economics of Brexit, but in many ways the political arguments are still more important. My father, a refugee from Hitler's Germany, experienced directly, like so many others of his generation, the consequences of extremism and conflict in Europe. For all its faults, the EU has brought Europe together and made both Europe and the world more secure. Internationally, our country has already suffered serious reputational damage from our Brexit convolutions. There is now less confidence in the UK as a rational, reliable and serious player standing for enduring values in the world. This was made crystal clear by the distinguished contributors from 5 major countries in As Others See Us, Neil McGregor's outstanding Radio 4 programmes. And it is the experience of so many of us who work internationally. Brexit, particularly a no-deal Brexit, will weaken the shared European voice in an increasingly challenging world at a time when international collaboration, democracy and human rights are under increasing threat. I've seen it firsthand in climate negotiations in the 2015 Paris Agreement and beyond how effective a UK within the EU can be on the international stage. Brexit, particularly a no-deal Brexit, would damage our universities and research because we would lose some of the outstanding staff and students who come to us from the EU. They, and those from outside the EU, see growing hostility to perceived outsiders and worry about the kind of society we may become. Those of us who work in universities are seeing this now. We could lose access to crucial research funding and vital research collaborations. All this would put at risk one of our most precious assets in a competitive world where skills, innovation and research will become ever more important. We also risk deep damage to other institutions right across British life, including our National Health Service, which relies so much on European staff over the whole range of its activities. And the head of the Met has emphasised strongly the risks to our security from no deal. On the economics, whilst I'm a professor of economics at the LSE and president of the Royal Economic Society, I stress that I speak personally and not on behalf of those institutions, and I focus on the medium term. The markets have spoken. Since the referendum in 2016, the exchange rate has been around 15% lower, indicative of a perceived weakening of medium-term prosperity. Business has described no deal as a wrecking ball. Serious economic modelling, whether in international institutions such as the IMF and OECD, our own Treasury, the CBI, or in research institutions and universities, has indicated medium-term losses, medium that is 10 to 15 years from now, from a no-deal Brexit of 5 to 8% or more of GDP. Of course we cannot predict with certainty, but the evidence points overwhelmingly one way. The losses arise in large measure from the new barriers, both non-tariff and tariff, erected by such a Brexit to our trade and investment with our major partner. The losses from the barriers embedded in the PM's proposition would also be large, albeit somewhat less. And let us be clear, the losses are likely to be most severe for the poorest people. My Lord's Brexit, my Lord's markets, business, economic analysis, common sense all point the same way. A no-deal Brexit produces great harm in the future, and it produces still more harm for decades to come. It cannot be a serious option. The best we can say about the PM's proposition is that the damage is a bit less. We're British, of course, and we would, I hope, keep calm and carry on, make the best of it. But what is the point of self-harm? Some appear to think that the substantial short-term damages from no deal would just be uncomfortable initial steps on the road to some sunny uplands. Yet it's remarkable that hardly any credible analysis is offered for such a story. It's just bluster, embellished by the odd confused number or muddled argument. For example, we're told that 10 billion or so in saved net EU contributions would cover any costs of a no-deal Brexit. That is nonsense when potential medium-term costs of 5% plus of GDP could be 100 to 150 billion a year or more. We're told, probably correctly, that other markets will grow faster than the EU. But there's little evidence that our trade with those markets would be enhanced by being outside the EU. Indeed, investing in and trading with the UK is much more attractive if we're inside the EU and a gateway to its markets. My Lords, a rational, analytical assessment of the evidence leads inexorably to these conclusions. No deal is deeply damaging. The Prime Minister's proposition will diminish us economically, politically, socially and internationally, and both are greatly inferior to what we have within the EU. Given that the people voted in a referendum in 2016, given that we now have, as we did not then, a specific proposition, given that we now know so much more, we must, as a matter of responsible, open and informed democracy, give the opportunity to the people of the UK to vote on the government's deal versus staying in the EU.
My Lords, I shall be brief because I spoke in December. I put my name down, in this case, in order to speak if something came up. And a couple of things have come up. The first is a small point, which is that in his opening speech, my noble friend the Minister answered a lot of points made in December, but I don't think he answered mine, which was that which of our preparations for leaving on WTO terms need EU cooperation at this stage, and are we getting that cooperation? Is it forthcoming? Now, the other thing that came up was that I was in the Chamber last Wednesday when the noble Lord Kerslake said, I do not buy the apocalyptic predictions. And a little before that, the noble Lord Steele of Akewood said, I do not for one moment believe the scaremongers. And I thought, hooray, at last, agreement. People are starting to realise that these scare stories about no deal are hugely exaggerated. But no, they were talking about different scare stories. They were talking about the scare stories about the risk of delaying Article 50 and holding a second referendum. The uncertainty that would persist, the anger that would erupt, the civil unrest, the delayed business investment referred to earlier today by the noble Lord Curry, the risk to democracy itself, and above all, of course, the risk of a Marxist government. The Remainers who dominate this chamber don't believe those scare stories, but they believe, magnify and exaggerate every scare story about leaving with no withdrawal agreement and going on WTO terms. No mad fear about Mars bars and insulin, water and sandwiches is too absurd to repeat. Why this double standard about risks in the future? Now, in one of the most colourful images used in this debate so far, the noble Lord Hennessy, my friend the noble Lord Hennessy, described people like me as being so insouciant that even if we were told that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse had asked for landing rights at Heathrow, we wouldn't be worried. Well, I took the noble Lord Hennessy aside an hour or so ago and I said, for a man of your erudition, Peter, are you unaware that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are entirely fictional characters? They are figments of the imagination of St. John the Evangelist, who was having a psychedelic dream at the time, as far as we can tell. I'm looking to the bishop's bench for confirmation here as to what exactly happened. Just as many of... I am blessed. Just as many of the other fears are fictional. My lords, we face a balance of risks and opportunities whichever way we go. I personally judge the risks to this country of delaying Brexit, the uncertainty, the anger, the disillusionment, the polarisation, the constitutional crisis, to be greater than the risks of leaving with no withdrawal agreement in place and arranging for WTO terms. And I do so mainly because we can mitigate the latter risks with preparation, as we are doing. And we can listen to people like Sir Rocket Forty, Lord Bamford, the head of HMRC, the chief executive of Calais, as my noble friend Lord Lilly mentioned. Whereas we will struggle to mitigate the risks of the other course of action. My lords, I venture to suggest that what most people in this chamber, the Remainers, are really scared about is that no deal might be a damp squib. It might all happen with only minor problems, and I think that's what really keeps them awake at night.
My lords, I've worked in the northeast with the noble Viscount and indeed with his father over many decades, and it's a pleasure to follow him. However, I fear on this issue we're on opposite sides of the fence. Maybe if we get together at some time in the future, we'll find a way of reconciling our views, but I fear not. I want to talk a little bit about the referendum because the one way of bringing reconciliation after a dispute is if the victor is generous in the attitude to those that have been defeated. And I don't think that the inflammatory and gross exaggerations about the outcome of the election by some of the members of the Brexiteers have in any way helped to bring about that reconciliation. We've heard a great deal about the mandate from the 17.4 million people in the country who voted in favour of Brexit. We've heard very little about the 16.1 million who voted to stay. And that amounts to some 34.73% of the electorate. 34% of the electorate. Now, I remember in the other place, back in 1979, we had great debates over the referendum on the devolution to Scotland. And George Cunningham proposed an amendment that there should be a threshold of 40% of the electorate voting in favour of the legislation if it was to go through. And of course, it didn't reach the 40%, very modest threshold for that legislation to go ahead. And I've got to say that in my experience, most clubs, institutions, businesses and every type of organisation, if they want to change the constitution, if there is going to be an amendment, they have a threshold above 50%. It's not 50% plus one, it's anything up to 75%, or two-thirds, before the vote becomes legitimate. And therefore, I think it really doesn't help, and hasn't helped, to have the sort of language that people, including the Prime Minister, have used, about catastrophic betrayal, about people being let down, of having, and members of Parliament saying they'd been instructed by this referendum when it's been so close, and indeed that they've been ordered to do what they... Have they not got minds? Have they not got judgment? Are they just going to accept the outcome of such a narrowly based referendum? So if there is going to be reconciliation, I hope some of the Brexiteers will start paying some attention to the 16 million who voted to remain and seek to reconcile the differences between them. The 40% rule would have, in effect, ruled out the result of this referendum. Now, I believe that we should move towards another vote on the deal that we've now got. But there are other dangerous myths and distortions that have been introduced into this whole debate, and we've heard some of them in the course of the debate this time. This whole project fear and attacks upon experts is deeply damaging, in my view, to our political debate. And I was very interested to see in last week's Sunday Times that David Smith, the economics editor, had done an analysis of the different forecasts that had been made by the experts. And almost at the top of that list came the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, which got 10 out of 10 on all the points that it had forecast for the year 2018. Second in that list came the much maligned CBI from the Brexit side, who got 9 out of 10. And who was bottom of the list, just out of interest? One Patrick Minford from the Liverpool Research Group, founder member of Economists for Free Trade, who came 3 out of 10 for his forecast for 2008 and had a similar result in 2017. Now, there are many things that have been said, but this attack upon policy by evidence-based activity is deeply damaging, in my view, to British politics and into government. And I hope that some of those attacks upon experts will cease. And there's been another, what I think is largely methodological thing, which is covered by Claire Forges in today's Times. She talks about the left behind and refutes the suggestion that the left behind voted in protest against the metropolitan elites. It's very amusing that the metropolitan elites that are making this accusation are educated at Eton and at Dulwich College and such places, and have the brass face to attack members of the other house in this place for being elitist. But the fact is that governments of all parties over decades have poured money in through development corporations. The noble Lord Heseltine has probably done more than any other single person in this country, not just in Liverpool, but everywhere in the country, in order to try and help those areas that have been hit by industrial change and by the wind down of the old industries. It's simply not true to suggest that simply because that 30, 40, 50 years of decline in those areas, people have voted against the EU. It's much more sophisticated and subtle as that, and a great deal has been done, and they should not be described as the left behind. Now, Lord Skidelsky and the noble Lord Selly referred to the powerful arguments that the Brexiteers has mounted. I've got to say, some of us, including myself and a lot on this bench, do take a view that this is not just about the price of customs and the cost of customs. We have an internationalist view of the world in which we believe that cooperation between countries is the best way to solve the problems that are facing us, more needed now than probably ever in the planet. And that being the case, we believe in cooperating with others through institutions like the EU. That is our commitment to it. It's not to do with the price of exports and the market. It's to do with people working together, and we are risking offending.
I wondered whether the noble lord was thinking of bringing his remarks to
the amendment, the motion tonight.
My Lords, I do believe that in 2016 the people of the United Kingdom gave a clear instruction to their elected representatives that the United Kingdom is to leave the EU. Under that democratic mandate, our government entered into negotiations with Europe seeking, I believe, an honourable settlement that would action the will of the people. However, we know that since that time there have been those who have sought to deliberately thwart the will of the electorate, much to the delight, of course, of those in Europe who have for years reaped the benefit from the billions that have flowed from the British Exchequer. A few weeks ago, we anticipated that we had arrived at decision time regarding Brexit. But in the middle of our previous debate, the Prime Minister pulled the vote, knowing that Parliament would not accept her deeply flawed deal. Now, from the beginning, the DUP's position has been consistently, publicly and privately stated. When we entered into the confidence and supply arrangement with the government, it was known that the DUP desired a sensible exit from the EU, which strengthened the Union and which benefited all parts of the United Kingdom. Our genuine endeavours have always been to secure a workable withdrawal agreement with the European Union that would provide security and stability for all. But we made it abundantly clear that we would not agree to a new border in the Irish Sea that would undermine the integrity of the United Kingdom and threaten our precious Union. Indeed, that was the position of the Prime Minister as well at that time. We insisted that no new regulatory barriers would develop between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, and that Northern Ireland must enjoy the same unfettered access for Northern Ireland business to the whole of the UK internal market. Now, although the Prime Minister and her negotiating team were aware of those demands, the government allowed themselves to be pushed around by Dublin and the rest of Europe and is presenting a withdrawal agreement which would place a regulatory border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, contrary to the explicit pledges given by our Prime Minister. The backstop arrangement that the EU has demanded leaves the entire UK trapped until the EU decides to release it. It is claimed that the backstop is necessary to prevent the erection of a fictional, now we find, so-called hard border. But in reality, the notion of the hard border was only a negotiating ploy on the part of the EU to secure their aims in the negotiations, of course, encouraged and at the behest of the Irish Republic. Now, we are being inundated with letters, assurances that Europe hopes will help the Prime Minister get her flawed deal over the line. If passed by Parliament, the withdrawal agreement becomes a legally binding international treaty. Therefore, only changes to the legally binding treaty can deliver the assurances that any true unionist could accept. From our experiences with successive governments, we know that only too well letters of comforts or promises are quite often meaningless, because, in effect, an international treaty supersedes and overrides even any contrary domestic legal provision. Sadly, promises and assurances can be swept away at the whim of any Prime Minister to suit the political survival of the government in office at that time. So let me make this clear. The Democratic Unionist Party will not support an internationally legally binding withdrawal agreement that does not protect the economic and constitutional integrity of the United Kingdom. Now, the DUP has been challenged that we do not represent the views of the electorate of Northern Ireland, and maybe face this. We are often reminded that 56% of the electorate in Northern Ireland voted Remain and that 44% voted for Leave. But let us scrutinise those figures, because in actual fact, in that 56%, we find that 88% of all nationalists, many of whom have worked for years for the destruction of the United Kingdom, voted to Remain, while 66% of unionists voted in the referendum to leave the EU. Of course, the question asked was whether or not the UK as a whole should remain or leave the EU. But in this agreement, Northern Ireland is to be economically and constitutionally separated from the rest of the United Kingdom and trapped within the EU, while the rest of the UK has the possibility to leave. No unionist worth of that name could accept such a proposal, And certainly my colleagues in the DUP, without apology, will vote against it. Now, on the 9th of January, the government published so-called assurances. But paragraph 43 says, this paper has focused particularly on the role that the Northern Ireland institutions will play in any scenario in which the backstop would take effect. My lords, they don't seem to get it. We reject the backstop. Those assurances merely allow for consultation, and that consultation with the Northern Ireland Assembly will have no ultimate bearing on the decision taken by Parliament, because paragraph 16 says Parliament will have the decisive role in the decision. So after the letters come the threats. The Secretary of State has raised the threat of the possibility of the border poll, and also that the UK Government's commitment to peace funding after 2020 seems now, by Karen Bradley, tied to the ratification of the withdrawal agreement. The Secretary of State resorting to such scaremongering and threats is to be deplored, and only proves how threadbare are the arguments in favour of the Prime Minister and her deal. Instead of the cast-iron guarantees previously promised when the vote was delayed in December, we have the wheels of Project Fear furiously turning. My lords, the mandate from the electorate was clear. The UK leaves the EU. Leave means leave. We don't need a dictionary to help us to understand what that means. Let us honour our moral obligations and leave on the 29th of March. We joined the ECC together, and as one, we should leave it together.
My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord the Minister for enabling this debate and for his careful consideration of all the contributions from both sides of this House. We know that emotions run deep and that this has ceased to be a party-aligned issue, with divisions in every party clearly manifesting themselves. But I'm hoping to add my voice to those who are conscious of the enormity of this historic moment. Some have argued that the future holds nothing but economic ruin. Some fear an economic flatlining or stagnation. And others still believe in the sunlit uplands of global trade, if only we could get the other side of Brexit. The reality is, if we're honest, that none of us has walked this way before, and no one really knows what will happen when we leave the European Union. But most of us know that this is a path we need to walk in some way, shape or form, and that all our debates are focused on finding the best way possible that delivers continued social and economic prosperity for this nation with such a remarkable history. This is because the vote to leave the European Union was a bold, surprising and unequivocal statement by millions of people who wanted to change the political, economic and social status quo. It was a moment in time, as far as they were concerned, a rational choice they felt, when those who had not felt heard by the establishment, and by many of us even in this chamber, where they expressed their desire to take back control of their wages and of their public services, of their borders and of this nation's sovereignty. And I'm afraid I have to disagree with the Noble Lord, Lord Wigglesworth. The events of June 23, 2016 should have kick-started a national debate aimed at understanding and reconciling the deep divides surfaced by the referendum in our nation. How can it be that two halves of the UK see the same country so completely differently? This should have mattered to us. And what can actually be done about it? This should have been our overwhelming focus and priority. Instead, the debate that was kick-started was one that has tragically driven divisions even deeper and left many feeling that the establishment has just continued not to hear them. For many, the debates we have here about all that could be lost hold little or no sway. As far as they are concerned, they felt that much had already been lost. It is important that we take time to hear and understand these perspectives, and that our withdrawal agreement honours their concerns. Concerns about their wages, the security of their homes and access to public services. This was not a minority group. It was 52% of those who voted, and we have to hear their concerns. But with the withdrawal agreement needs to be right for the whole country, honouring the concerns of those who voted leave, the concerns of those who voted remain, and delivering a strong foundation for economic and social prosperity for future generations. The withdrawal agreement addresses a number of the structural and economic issues raised by the vote. For these reasons, the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement does achieve some of the Brexit objectives, and for that reason I will support it, although I suspect there is still a final step to go if it is to pass in the other place. But there are issues that the withdrawal agreement cannot and does not address. There is a deeper malaise to be treated, deeply linked to job insecurity, access to housing, education and healthcare. If we are truly to change how people's lives feel to them at present, whilst leaving the EU is a critical first step, the vote must also trigger wider reform and a better and clearer vision of social justice and significantly greater social cohesion. These issues should be as strongly and as passionately debated by members of this House as any withdrawal agreement. In light of the Brexit vote, we have a once-in-a-lifetime chance to reshape public policy so that it genuinely helps those who feel that they have little stake in society and respond directly to the concerns that were surfaced in the referendum. In years to come, the EU referendum will be seen as a turning point in Britain's long history. Depending on what we do next, it could simply be remembered as the moment we finally agree a withdrawal agreement and progress towards exiting the European Union. A moment of political process, a technical adjustment to the UK's relationship with Europe. But if that is the case, then we will have failed. Instead, we must listen with compassion and humility to those who desperately wish for another way. For us as political leaders, our duty is to provide the wisdom and courage required to allow us to move towards a new settlement for Britain, not just keep alive old and current divides. Then there is the hope of prosperity and social justice for all and a united kingdom.
My Lords, we are living through a political crisis without equal in our post-war history. Labour's front bench in the Commons has to play a decisive role in the outcome, and without their support, it will be difficult for any option to carry. Yet their present stance comes across as a supine unwillingness to declare their hand, and it's on this that I want to focus my remarks. Jeremy Corbyn wants a general election, but for weeks we've been waiting for the motion of no confidence. For him, such an election would be as much about issues of class and inequality as it would be about Brexit. He aims to unite working people on a mandate to negotiate a so-called jobs-first withdrawal. If his effort to force an election fails, he would still prefer a negotiated Brexit to a people's vote. Now, a Labour government could, of course, abandon the red lines that have so unnecessarily and counterproductively constrained the Prime Minister. And listening to Sir Keir Starmer and his unequivocal commitment to a customs union and full participation in the single market, such a decisive shift would be entirely realistic. However, Mr. Corbyn and those closest to him in his office favour a much more qualified policy. In their customs union, Britain and the EU would have an equal say on future trade deals. For them, the single market avoids border barriers, except they want to break free of the competition and state aid rules which are fundamental to the whole concept of a level playing field. There would be no willingness in Brussels to entertain what for the EU would be a most extraordinary set of propositions: to give a non-member state a veto over the Union's autonomous trade policy and to license Britain to act as a competitor rogue state. In practice, there will be 3.5 alternatives to no deal after tomorrow's Commons vote. The half choice is full membership of the customs union. It's only a half choice, for without alignment of single market regulations there will need to be a hard border in Northern Ireland, and it's the WTO rules that will require that. And the Customs Union therefore requires a Northern Ireland backstop of some kind to be permanent. Norway, or Common Market Mark II, as Nick Bowles now calls it, is highly problematic. It requires a level of trust on the EU's part that in the last 2 years Britain has squandered. For the EU fear that Britain will not behave responsibly like Norway, but as a much larger competitor outside the EU, we would be constantly pushing against the limits and loopholes of the EEA rulebook. And domestically, for how long could a great nation such as ours live happily as a rule taker? The third possibility is that without decisive progress towards a comprehensive alternative, Mrs. May's deal staggers on life support, in the hope that someday sufficient Labour backbenchers from strongly Leave constituencies, in fear and fright of no deal, will eventually back her deal as the only option available. My Lords, this would be a disaster for my party. Whole swathes of progressive opinion would never forgive us for the betrayal of their European commitment. And to avoid this, Labour must move decisively to back a people's vote. Some argue Labour cannot be seen to betray Labour supporters who voted Leave. But frankly, it's the leadership of the Leave campaign who have betrayed those Leave voters with their extravagant promises and lies. And support for Remain has strengthened significantly among 2017 Labour voters since the referendum. In my view, and I'm sorry to say this, the obstacle to a shift in Labour policy is a different one. The leadership group around Mr Corbyn has an outdated view of the EU as an instrument of global capitalism and United States imperialism. Their political economy is stuck in a 1970s ambition for socialism and in one country. Unfortunately, I was alive then, it didn't work then, and it certainly isn't going to work half a century later. The EU has many faults and needs much reform, but uniquely in the world, and however imperfectly, it offers a means of structured cooperation between countries that can be used to promote progressive values, to promote human rights and democracy, to work for peace, to advance economic justice for poorer nations, to tackle climate change, not just to manage migration, but to address the injustices that drive its fundamental causes, and to ensure that big corporations pay their fair share of taxes, to bring the digital monopolists to heel, and to prevent a race to the bottom in standards, which is crucial in terms of workers' rights and consumer and environmental standards. So there is a way forward. Labour must back a people's vote now and must listen to the overwhelming view of Labour members and Labour supporters. We must gain the courage to come out for Remain.
Well done. Well done. My Lords, as ever, it's a pleasure to follow my Cumbrian neighbour and friend, the noble Lord Liddell, even though I don't imagine he would necessarily describe me as progressive. Now, my Lords, the first time I heard the phrase Brexit means Brexit, I thought it was a snappy, purposive soundbite. But I've now come to the conclusion it is probably at the heart of our nation's present discontent. Now, the politics of the referendum, as others have said, nearly 3 years ago, was about the kind of United Kingdom we wanted for the next generation, or possibly even longer. And those who wanted change went through the portal called Brexit.
and beyond was the brave new world. Not merely were there two main campaigning organisations with rather different emphases, there were in fact at least two somewhat hallucinogenic visions of Shangri-La on offer, and they are mutually incompatible. Now, as we can see now, the real question facing this country is, do we want to remain in the European solar system, if I can put it that way, or do we wish to board Starship Enterprise for a different galaxy? These are mutually incompatible destinations, and they cannot be triangulated, because the best way to bring about one interferes with effectively delivering the other. Now, as long as Brexit was not precisely and properly defined, the government and supporters of Leave could more or less coalesce. But it's now clear that different members of the government, like voters in general, have fundamentally different views of what they were voting for. And because of this internal contradiction, there can be no agreement on which of the outcomes the referendum delivered. Now, that is the crisis of now. And the reality is, in my view, that the Brexit of the referendum is an impossibility, in exactly the same way as William Pitt the Elder, Earl of Chatham, explained to your lordships about 250 years ago, telling us, rightly, it was impossible to conquer America. And since it's an impossibility, it cannot be mandated or brought into being, and so the government cannot deliver it. And let's be clear, that's not the government's fault. The Prime Minister has clearly striven mightily, albeit changing her own personal picture of Brexit as she goes. But what is on offer in her negotiated deal is not the Brexit of the referendum, it's a changeling. Now, my Lords, based on my own experience and expertise, and I'll draw attention to my entry in the register, I'm sure she is right that her deal is better than no deal. But I don't think either deal is good enough or delivers the referendum, which, as I said, I think is an impossibility. Furthermore, each is going to be a precursor to years and years of acrimonious wrangling. And I don't think anybody wants that, but I think we need to be clear that that is the likely eventuality. Furthermore, I can't see either of these two options delivering an especially deep or special relationship. Now, the problem is that those who voted Remain feel cheated by the shenanigans and cheating that surrounded the referendum, and those who voted Leave are worried they'll be cheated out of the outcome, either by the Remainers or by advocates of an incompatible version of Brexit to their own. And it is a terrible mess. But, my Lords, just as politics is the art of the possible, so Brexit has become the crisis of the impossible. And it's not a question of taking back control, it's a matter of getting it under control. And if nobody else can do it, Parliament, and that is to say, the other place and your Lordship's House together have got to do it, because we can't go on like this.
My Lords, it's always a pleasure to follow my good friend Lord Inglewood, and I'd like to begin by drawing attention to my entries in the register and remind members, if they needed reminding, that I'm a strong advocate of remaining fully involved in the EU. A number of people have said during the course of this debate this is a great turning point, as though it's never happened before. I'd like to start with a bit of history and draw attention to the fact that it has happened before. In the early 1930s, we had the Peace Pledge ballot. That destroyed politics in Britain right up to the Second World War. It shaped our attitude to the League of Nations. It made us cowards in the Rhineland. It distorted a policy in Abyssinia, which led Italy into its adventures there. And overall, it was a disaster, compounded, let me say, by regular voting against the defence estimates by the Labour Party and a failure of the Conservative Party to face up to its international duties. We face doing that again. This government is in danger of being complicit in an act of monumental moral cowardice, which is where we are today. There was never a possibility that we will get away without paying our bills. The 39 billion which is being talked about as though it was some donation, is in fact the sum total of the liabilities that we have contracted sitting round the table in Brussels over many years. It contains all of the decisions that we have been complicit in taking. So we can't get away without it unless we want to be international debt welshers, which will be taken through every court in Europe, and we will of course be totally distrusted by any international civil servants, because they will say if they could abandon their contribution to the European Union, they could abandon it to the UN, to UNESCO, to any one of the international bodies that we belong to. We would become international pariahs. So that certainly isn't on. But it was also inevitable that the final deal would be fashioned in such a way that no other country would be tempted to follow us. The terms have got to be, for the 27, substantially bad enough for others not to decide to leave. Allied to this, of course, it's enabled a few outstanding grudges to be sorted out. Britain has blocked European defence for years. Now Germany and France can go ahead. And we've been excluded from projects such as Galileo. And as the now resigned but very able Minister Sam Gyimah said, we have no voice, no vote, no veto. That is where we are at the moment. We're told we'll be consulted to the degree necessary. We might well, but our voice will only count if it suits the people who are listening to it. We won't be in the room. We won't have the voice, the vote, or the veto. We will be outside the room. I just want to now mention a couple of very practical details. When we met Gavin Barwell as Conservative members, he drew attention to something called the non-regression clause on workers' rights. But when I challenged him, he said that, oh no, I'm sorry, it isn't enforceable. Now, I want to ask the Minister not to reply tonight, because it's too complex probably for his time in summing up, but I want to ask him to place in the library a letter detailing what he intends to do about protecting employment rights within that non-regression commitment, particularly those covering paid holidays, rights for part-time workers, time off for working mothers and fathers, equal pay for women, and limits on working hours, including a commitment to maintain the protection afforded by the Working Time Directive. Now, I see that Lord Mandelson has gone. I was going to point... Oh, no. Lord Mandelson, who wrote me many letters when I was a Euro MP, asking me not to endorse the Working Time Directive. So I feel I am entitled to ask this government whether it will endorse the Working Time Directive. If I could just finish and upset a few more people on the way, possibly. I would counsel the government, finally, not to do the politics of fear. It isn't playing in the galleries. I live in Cambridge. Over the Christmas holiday, I talked to many people. Their general reaction was, oh, we heard all this before, didn't we? You said this in the run-up to the referendum, and nothing happened. So come off it, Richard. Get real. The argument for Europe is not about the price of carrots. It's about the future of this country as a player on the world stage and as a country that gives leadership and example by the values that it believes in and it projects. Yeah. And the amount of money that we send to Brussels, which people carry on about, is frankly the price of a packet of peanuts compared to the donation and the things that we can do to make this world a better place. So please stop the Brussels bashing and start realising where our future can lie, and don't make the mistake of the 1930s again. Yeah, very good.
My Lords, it is a pleasure to follow such a strong speech in favour of remaining. And also, I'd like to say that it's a pleasure to follow the Noble Lord Inglewood, who, to my disconcertion, has made my speech almost verbatim in some respects. Because what I wanted to argue and to offer the House was the thought that the task which the Prime Minister undertook two and a half years ago was probably impossible. She could not deliver it. She's done the best she could to deliver it, and she's done her best. But it is not one that protects the interests of this country well enough. The price is too high. In my first half of this speech, on the 5th of December, I said that I could not recommend to my children or grandchildren a deal which left this country economically poorer, politically weaker, arguably less safe in the world. And nothing I have heard in these 3 days has changed that view. But I want to add a point about the divisiveness of the debate. We've been told that if we have a people's vote, a second referendum, it may unleash strong passions, and that we shouldn't do so because it's undemocratic. Well, on the undemocratic point, I long for George Orwell's comments on a criticism of asking the people what they think as undemocratic. I think it is thought speak of a kind which is quite hard to understand. But on the division, I think we have to recognise that the problem lies in a lack of clarity of thought about what Brexit was meant to achieve. I'm not a politician, but it seems to me that the Brexit campaign, by vagueness, managed to unite some very disparate, different groups. I think that I've been familiar for many years, working for ministers of different governments, that in both the Labour and the Conservative parties, there have been a strong streak of deep, visceral dislike of Europe. I've worked, I think, a third of my career, I've worked for ministers who really felt very strongly against the Union, even though they were in governments that supported it. I can recall being told by Tony Benn, who I worked for 4 years, that I was a member of the politico-military establishment and that the EU, was a part of a global capitalist plot. He didn't put it quite like that, but that was the essence of what he meant. And I can remember Mrs. Thatcher passionately telling her cabinet that the British people argued for, consented to joining the common market, but never consented to joining any political union. And I think the roots of Brexit in the Conservative and Labour parties, although they are strange bedfellows, as we see, go back and are very deep. Now, political movements, though, only succeed when they resonate with the public and with the dreams and unhappiness or disappointments of people or their ambitions and desires. And the question is, what did Brexit resonate with? And I think it resonated through its vagueness with all sorts of different people, different groups, who wanted someone to blame and who had been encouraged, perhaps by an anti-European press, to blame Brussels, fairly or unfairly, usually unfairly. And I think that the problem is that those groups who are disappointed, perhaps by austerity, by the financial crisis, and we should remember that financial crises ripple through the decades that follow them, have political effects 10 years later. We should, and I think that they also fed into north-south divide, resentment at not sharing in the prosperity of which Europe has generated, and an unhappiness about the speed at which immigrants were coming to this country. Now, those are all very different grievances, and you cannot find one policy which satisfies one deal that meets all those problems and all those needs. So, and I also find myself thinking, where are we now on the eve of a big political crisis? We only have 10 weeks until we have the leave date. There are not many options left that you can establish on such a big issue in 10 weeks. And the essence of where we are, I think, was summed up by the noble Lord Armstrong, when he said, when you're in a hole, stop digging. My view is just stop for a moment. We need clear thought. Unless you know where you want to get to, you're not going to be able to get there. Unless you can agree your destination, your path will be confused and muddled. And it's a political process that can only be solved in the Commons. If the Commons accept the deal that is before them, that settles it. I think we all have to accept that. If the Commons disagree with the deal, they then have to consider no deal. And I think that is, for reasons I won't go over, I think that is far too risky and unacceptable. We can't gamble with the fate of this country. The question then is, are there any other options? Time is very, very short to explore that. I think the need for an extension of the deadline is almost inescapable. And I think that the question then becomes whether we have a referendum. And if people say it is too divisive to have a referendum, all I would say is, whatever we do, whether we remain or whether we leave, our relationship with Europe is going to be divisive. I think that it will only go on until once we have a clear clarity about the destination we want to reach and what sort of country we want to be. It may only go on until we are all exhausted or until a younger generation takes over. I think the young are actually the solution to the problem we're in now. And I believe the future will only sort itself out when they have the chance to take command. If we leave, I shall simply drink a toast to the young, under whose leadership in 30 or 40 years' time we will almost certainly apply to rejoin the Union. Until then, I shall vote for the noble Baroness's amendment.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure and privilege to follow, I might say, my Cambridgeshire colleagues, Noble Lord Balfe and Lord Wilson of Dinton. When one is in Cambridge, as my noble friend said, one gets a different view, perhaps, of the British people's attitude. I personally think, when in Cambridge, what we learn by talking to people in Cambridge is that the more the diversity, the more the benefits of migration to this country, not for economic purposes, the more we have benefited from it. The more I am reinforced when I look at my own area by the reasons why I voted Remain in the referendum. I should, in passing, say I want particularly to draw attention to my interests as recorded in the register. Over 20 years ago, I managed the European parliamentary elections for the Conservative Party. We fought a campaign which won. My noble friend Lord Callanan may recall he was one of the successful candidates in that election. We won that election on the basis of in Europe, not run by Europe. Actually, I don't think my view has ever changed. And it was reflected, I think, in some of the contributions to this debate, that the British people really want to be in the common market. It's exactly what Margaret said. It's what my noble friend Lord Tebbit used to tell me time and time again when I was working for him. We voted for a common market, we'd like to have one. We didn't vote for a political union, and we don't want one. And the issue at the moment is, how can we give the British people what they voted for in the referendum? Now, my successor in Cambridgeshire is, I think, probably tomorrow going to vote against the withdrawal agreement, and she does so in pursuit of a second referendum. I think to do that, to reject a solution to the question which government has derived, a solution to the question, what is our objective through Brexit, and to reject it on grounds that we didn't like the result of the referendum, and I certainly didn't like the result of the referendum, is, I think, morally bankrupt. We have to start by trying honestly to achieve the result that the British people voted for in the referendum. Now, you can say it's not quite right,
and I think the Labour Party is saying it's not quite right. The Labour Party may be politically motivated. It's for them to say or to deny by the idea that if you pull the pillars down in the temple, maybe actually the resulting disaster enables a general election or a referendum, and the Labour Party won't be blamed for the catastrophe that follows. But actually the Labour Party should take responsibility too. They were elected to this Parliament on the basis that they would implement the result of the referendum. Now there's a difference, and I want to emphasise this in the couple of minutes available, that there is a difference between the government and the Labour front bench, but which actually may point to where one needs to go in the event that the withdrawal agreement as currently proposed is not accepted tomorrow. And it is in the question of a customs union, of a permanent customs union. I would remind this House that during the passage of the Withdrawal Act, the largest majority against the government's position was in pursuit of a customs union. And that, and the fact that it is the Labour Party's at least one evident policy, does raise the question that actually the response tomorrow is not to say, well, it must be Remain versus no deal, is actually maybe to say, well, actually, perhaps we can adapt the withdrawal agreement further and create what is in effect a customs union, a single customs territory, obviating the need for the hard border in Northern Ireland between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland to a large extent, and frankly, I think, creating the possibility of a common market in goods, while making sure, which is the principal objection in my view to any kind of EEA Norway solution, not becoming rule takers in relation to services, and we are predominantly for the future of services economy. And that will allow us, frankly, to undertake independent trade policy in relation to services, to investment, to regulations and rules which are the meat and drink of modern trade negotiations. It's not about tariffs, it's about those rules and regulations. So I would urge on those at the, in the other place, looking at what I think of as the meaningful debate, even if we don't get the meaningful vote, that they might read what we've said, they might think about what we've said, and I think they might reflect that whatever their personal views, actually they have a responsibility as parties and as members of parties to deliver on the Brexit referendum, and in the Conservative Party to support the Prime Minister, whom that is one thing that has happened since the debate in December, which I didn't have a chance to take part in, is that the Prime Minister has secured the further mandate from her own members of Parliament to take forward her position. So I think we should do that. The final thing I would say is just this. The day after the referendum, friends of ours who are from Central European countries sent an email. It wasn't to us, it was to our children. They have children a bit younger than ours, and they said, we're really sorry this has happened, but we want you to know that whatever happens in the future, you are Europeans and you are our friends. And we want your children to know that for the future too. And I think we should absolutely put that at the forefront of our thinking. We are Europeans, we are friends, and it is on that basis that we should conduct our negotiations, and I hope bring them to a successful conclusion.
Very good. Very good. My Lords, it's a pleasure to follow the noble Lord Lansley. I see the latest exchange of letters between the EU and the Prime Minister and the advice from the Attorney General as frankly just window dressing, aspirational but having very little meaning. I sort of compare it with the vision of Neville Chamberlain coming back from meeting Hitler saying that peace in our time. It was peace in our time, it just delayed things for a bit longer, and this is what we have now. It's just delaying things for a few more years. Because we've discussed endlessly today and other days the question of the Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland, where is the frontier? But if we have a different single market and customs union between us here and the Republic, we're going to have a frontier somewhere. It may be in the RSC, it may be between the Northern and Southern, but it's going to happen somewhere unless we somehow integrate. And I think we should be told, if we're not having a a hard border, what are we going to have? Because it is pretty fundamental. Well, Lords, what did the public actually vote for in the referendum? It was to leave the EU. But it seems to me that the Prime Minister and her Cabinet have since then added several red lines which are very unhelpful, I think, to the economy and to people's understanding of what may happen. And I don't think it's what the people voted for in the referendum. I mean, a couple of examples. To me, there's a continuing obsession with immigration and an inability to separate asylum seekers, enormous numbers coming in the shape of 20 people in one boat, compared with the hundreds of thousands who come from other parts of the EU to work here, work very hard and very well, and most of them send money home to help them from wherever they come from. NHS, agriculture, and the hospitality industries spring to mind. And Noble Baroness McIntosh talked a lot about the agriculture sector. But considering that something like 90% of the workers in slaughterhouses come from Bulgaria, who's going to replace them? Who's going to pick our fruit and veg? I think Michael Gove was speaking at the Oxford farming conference last week and said it'll all be all right because everything will be automated. I'm not sure how you can pick raspberries with an automatic machine. Maybe somebody can, but we need these people. And unless we're going to instruct the unemployed people here to do particular jobs, then I think we're lost. I lived in Romania in the communist era in the 70s, and I watched the way local people were forced to do jobs. If they wanted to live somewhere, have a flat, they had to work. And it wasn't pleasant, because if the people that didn't work didn't have anywhere to live, and they sat begging beside the street. Now, I know that, I suspect that Noble Viscount Ridley is calling some of us on this side Marxists or communists. I'm not one of those, but I think we should be free to choose what job we have, but we do have to encourage people to come here and work hard. My Lords, the second one, of course, is the single market and the customs union, which many noble lords have spoken about. The queues that will happen at frontiers, not just at Dover, but other places and on the island of Ireland. We've all been working on it, we've all seen what's happened, and there will be queues because there are controls, and you can't do anything about the controls if we... and it's not just the customs and things like that, it's also the phytosanitary and controls like that. And there's also the question then, the consequence of big companies and small companies leaving the UK because they can't get their goods in and out. We all read about the motor manufacturers, but SMEs are equally important, and I've got a friend in Cornwall who runs a company with 8 employees who's actually already moved to Netherlands because he can't cope with the problems that are likely to happen after Brexit. So the third one, my Lords, very briefly, my noble friend Lord Liddell mentioned it, is the competition and state aids. They are very, very important, and I know that maybe the leader of the Labour Party thinks that we want to abolish state aid rules so he can give lots of government grants to his friends. But actually the Tory party have got there first, giving a £13 million contract to a new ferry service to go from Ramsgate to Ostend without seeking competitive tenders and without saying what it's for. So we all need this state aids legislation, and I hope it will continue. My Lords, where does this lead us? Many noble lords have spoken about it, but Parliament has to honour the wishes of the people in the referendum 2.5 years ago. Would Parliament do that 5 or 10 years ahead? I don't know. But surely it is, in a parliamentary democracy, it's for the members of Parliament to make the final decision. It seems to me that the only solution, if we're going to increase our prosperity and retain jobs and business, is actually for the members of Parliament to make a decision themselves. And why shouldn't they do that on a free vote? I'm sure those who have been in the House of Commons will tell me it's completely impossible, but why shouldn't they? They're quite sensible people, most of them anyway, and probably much better at making a decision than the general population. So, my Lords, I hope that we will see sense. I fully support my noble friend's amendment tonight, but let us remember that we've been in Europe for many reasons for 40 years, but the most important thing is to have preserved and retained peace, and we must continue to do so.
My Lord, listening to this debate criss-cross the chamber, not all the speeches on one side going one way or the other, it reminded me of a story that Dennis Healey used to talk about in the 60s when he was Minister of Defence. And Dennis told of a man who came to him saying that he had the answer to the Russian submarines patrolling undetected in the North Sea. And his solution was to boil the North Sea. And when the water evaporated, the Russian submarines would be left high and dry for all to see. But how do I boil the sea, said Dennis. Look here, Mr. Healy, said the man. I've given you the solution. It's up to the government to work out its implementation. And, my Lords, 3 Brexit secretaries and the abandonment of numerous red lines, we are left with a compromise which no one defends as anything but the least worst solution. As Lord Wilson indicated, what the Prime Minister has been trying to do so valiantly over the last 2.5 years is to boil the sea. Because the mandate which Lord Lansley and Baroness Stroud and others have so called for about this impressive 17.4 million vote ignores the fact that that vote was spread across a wide view of opinions. It goes from Sir John Edwards' plans for a light touch, small state, buccaneering free trade country to the socialist utopia that someone like Len McCluskey wants. It wasn't a single mandate to achieve a single objective, and hence the problem the Prime Minister now faces. It's becoming abundantly clear that the Prime Minister's compromise offers only the prospect of us stumbling out of Europe with jagged edges and a mass of unfinished business, satisfying no one and ensuring, let's have no doubt, that the civil war in the Conservative Party will continue. In the circumstances we now find ourselves, I do not see it as an outrage to give the people an opportunity to take stock in the light of the realities which have been exposed over the last 2.5 years. The great benefit of living in a democracy is that there are mechanisms there which enable people to change their mind. This is not the charge of the Light Brigade, where we follow orders regardless of the knowledge that someone has blundered. Nor are we like Macbeth, so far steeped in blood that returning would be as tedious as to go back. We are a parliamentary democracy, with all the freedoms and maturity that that term implies. If ever there was a time to take back control, now is the moment. My Lords, I'll be followed in this debate by Lord Pearson of Rannoch. I'm sure we will once again be presented with his particularly dystopian view of the European Union. I've been in here nearly 25 years, and I will give Lord Pearson full marks for consistency. What would worry me as a Conservative is how over those nearly 25 years Lord Pearson's views have moved from being a rather eccentric voice on those backbenches to the heart of the Conservative argument for where we go next. So let me repeat the view that has motivated me since my student days.
and which is reinforced in the 50 years of working with and in the European Union. The European Union is the most successful example of multinational cooperation the world has yet seen. It has set an example to the world of how old enmities can be replaced by fruitful joint endeavours. And it has massively helped to increase Britain's influence and prosperity. Recovering from the last 2 years will be no easy task. It will need Parliament and parliamentarians to regain the confidence to make decisions in the national interest. If, as I hope, that means giving the people the opportunity to have their own meaningful vote, then those of us who will be campaigning to remain will have to address the fears which Lord Skidelsky and others drew attention to, which were so successfully exploited in 2016. We will have to renew our commitment to a Europe of peace and prosperity underpinned by human rights and the rule of law. This is a once-in-a-generation decision which every parliamentarian must take individually. It is the Corn Laws, it's the Norway debate. It is our opportunity to learn the lessons from this ghastly episode and to say to the young people who have to live with the consequences of it, here is your European future. The hope lives on, the dream will never die. My Lords, I will be voting for Baroness Smith's amendment when this House divides.
My Lords, I'm most grateful to the noble Lord McNally for his generous comments. And I refer students of Brexit, the Brexit saga, to what I said in your Lordship's House on the 30th of January, the 16th of May and the 20th of November last year, and indeed on many occasions over the last 25 years. My Lords, the burden of my recent song has been that our politicians and bureaucrats have never done a commercial deal in their lives, and so don't understand the strength of our hand in Brussels or how to play it. I have recently come to see that our political media suffers from the same disability, and so all three are now joined together in a lengthy cacophony with which our real people are getting very frustrated and angry. Much of this noise, my Lords, is now directed against the supposed horrors of leaving the EU on the 29th of March without a deal. But I would have thought that the speech here today from the noble Lord Lilly, and the paper he published via Global Britain and Labour Leave on the 7th of January, entitled 30 Truths About Leaving on WTO Terms, together with yesterday's paper from Economists for Free Trade, No Deal is the Best Deal for Britain, should comprehensively close all that nonsense down. If those who in truth want to reverse the referendum result do not agree with those papers, perhaps they would publish a rebuttal, point by point and author by author. I look forward to reading it, not very hopefully, my Lords, because they can't. So, my Lords, no deal is fine, but I come back to a concept which is even cleaner and simpler. The government should accept that it will never get a deal out of the Commission which respects our referendum result, because the Commission's main aim in life is to keep its project of European integration afloat, and if we break free and make a success of our restored independence, that aim will be even more damaged than it is already. So, my Lords, we should resile from clauses 2 to 5 of Article 50, cease dealing with the Commission, and make a generous offer to the real people of Europe through the Council of Ministers. Those real people, my Lords, are after all our friends, whereas the Commission is not. We should offer them reciprocal residence for a period to be agreed, our continuing security support from GCHQ and our membership of the Five Eyes, and continuing free trade together, but under the WTO instead of the Luxembourg Court. My Lords, that offer would be generous because there are some 3.5 million EU citizens living here and only some 1.2 million of our people living there. And because if our offer of continuing free trade is not accepted and we are forced to trade on normal WTO terms, their exporters will pay us some 13.5 billion in new tariffs, and our exporters will pay Brussels some 5.5 billion, a profit to us of some £8 billion. My Lords, those figures were confirmed by Civitas this morning. And the WTO would allow us to subsidise any of our exporters hit by the $5.5 billion out of that $8 billion profit. But, my lords, if our offer is accepted, we go on in free trade with our customers in the EU just as we do now. Nothing changes, and the vastly inflated problem of the Irish border disappears. My lords, your lordships will be aware that I floated the suggestion several times in the last year, but the government have always replied that they can't follow it, and I quote, because we are a law-abiding nation, by which they meant that we can't resile from clauses 2 to 5 of Article 50, because that would be breaking the EU treaty. But now the Luxembourg Court has actually agreed with me and confirmed that we can indeed resile from Article 50 unilaterally if we want to. That is agreed with me and my advisers. I received a helpful written answer on the 27th of November from the government saying that the UK has unilaterally withdrawn from their obligations under no less than 52 multinational treaties since 1988. So why not this one, my lords? And of course, my lords, if our offer is not accepted by the Council on behalf of their people, we shouldn't pay any money at all to Brussels after the 29th of March, as indeed we shouldn't under no deal. If it is accepted, we could be generous about that too. My lords, I don't know if the government is taking advice from businessmen who know how to do deals and who understand the EU, but I fear not. Because if they did, those businessmen would tell them the most obvious madness in the government's approach to these negotiations has been to allow the Eurocrats to put the question of any leaving payment up front, instead of taking it last. Can I ask the noble Lord the Minister, when he comes to reply, whether nothing is agreed until everything is agreed still applies in this respect? My lords, I end by underlining the warning from several noble lords that if the referendum result is not respected, thanks to the obvious and bewildering incompetence of our political and bureaucratic class, we may be sowing the seeds of civil unrest. Already, many of our white working class are simmering with anger at the way those in authority have turned a blind eye to the grooming gang scandal, and I fear it would be foolish to provoke them further in this sorry matter. The deal, my lords, isn't a deal at all. It is an abject capitulation. If it is voted down in the Commons tomorrow, I invite the government to at least consider my proposal. If they haven't the vision or the political will to do that, and I fear that they may not, then let us embrace no deal in the WTO and go forth into the world with good cheer.
My Lords, I never thought just over 20 years ago when I came to your Lordship's house that this evening I would be debating withdrawing from Europe. I think the noble Lord McNally is right. The noble Lord who's just spoken, previously many thought he was not really on the ball, but he clearly is on the ball in relation to the challenges we face today. I make it quite clear I voted to remain. I had the privilege of working overseas for 5 years of my life, most of it in Southeast Asia, although a period in Canada. I'm used to trading. I'm used to exporting. I'm certainly used to negotiating with Indians in India. So my background is as someone who does understand industry and commerce. I was a founder member, I think, of the Young European Managers Association in the periods of the 60s. I was an active member for the Council of the European campaign for the Conservative Party. So my heritage in relation to Europe, even in my second name, Wolfgang, I think that says enough for most people in the chamber. It's in the genes, as they say. And yet here am I standing before you, deeply worried about what is happening today. I've actually, in a sense, suffered from the cause. And my noble friend, the former Speaker of the House of Commons, knows that I was her Deputy Speaker, but more relevantly, Chairman of Ways and Means. I took the whole of the Maastricht Treaty,
Just to remind your Lordship, that created the European Union, set up the euro, set up the ability for families to locate somewhere within the European Union. 25 days on the floor of the House in the Commons, 4 all-night sittings, and all it was 4 clauses and the title. And at the end of the day, thanks to the Tony Benn MP, came into my office and said, I'm moving a vote of no confidence in you, Mr. Chairman of Ways and Means. I said, well, what have I done? You've done it far too well, he said. We've not really managed to persuade the government to change. And I said, that's all very well. At any rate, we saw him off, and the majority I got on that fateful evening of the 27th of April 93, 367. So my commitment is there. But when I look at what is happening today or tomorrow in the other place, I am deeply worried. Because I deeply believe in what was the European Union as far as we were concerned, I personally don't think what my friends in the Commons face is an easy decision. The suggestions that are put before them are difficult to vote on. And we all know, perhaps we all don't all know, but certainly I believe the methodology used to negotiate leaves much to be desired, not least a change of management on the way through. So I am deeply concerned, but it is for those in the Commons to make their decision. But I sat for a marginal seat. Majority is 179, 142, improved a bit over time. But when you sit in a marginal seat, you listen to what people are thinking. And it was quite clear, was it not, to all of us in the referendum, that the majority of our citizens wanted to leave the EU. That's there in black and white. Unfortunately, the then Prime Minister didn't quite decide whether it was binding or not. But they made that decision, and I think we should respect that decision. And if tomorrow the vote goes against the government, then I think Her Majesty's government have to think really seriously about no deal. So I made some calls over the weekend to the hauliers in Northampton. What happens, I said? Are you going to be stuck at Dover or Calais? No, they say. We've known it's coming. We've made preparation. We've altered the software. No lorry leaves Northampton to go to the continent unless it's got clearance. And they're totally confident they can get that in a few weeks. I talked to other industrialists and commercial. Look at the City of London. They've invested with micro offices right the way through the 27 countries. And this is happening up and down our country today. It has happened. Yes, the small businesses face problems, and Her Majesty's government is supposed to be doing something about that. So at the end of the day, we all of us have to face up to our responsibilities. That if the great British public wanted to come out of the EU, then, and if tomorrow they don't vote for the government, then in my judgment, we have to look at a hard deal. It is a deal, it's a challenging deal, but we want some leadership, we need some leadership, and we need some nerve. But the opportunities are there. Our trade balance with the EU is not that smart. We're in deficit and have been for years. We have never really looked at the Commonwealth. Commonwealth, 2.5 times the number of people there are in the EU. Ageing population in Europe. Young, thrusting population in the Commonwealth. My Lords, I believe the opportunities are there, and it all depends on tomorrow evening. If the government get their majority, so be it. Good. But if they don't, then I am not one that's afraid to stand up and accept that a no deal is the way forward.
My Lords, at the start of this debate, the Right Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, expressed two objectives. The first was rightly that there should be proper regard for real facts on the ground. He cited East Kent and elsewhere. The second, also right, was a desire to see a deeply fractured nation drawn back together by some form of reconciliation. In my view, the worst thing about the Cameron referendum was arguably not the absurdity of trying to take so complex an issue to a conclusion by that lamentable route, or his palpable fear of Farage, or that he scuttled away after his failure. Worst was the deep divide that he bequeathed to the people of the United Kingdom. And while I hope for reconciliation, I'm not going to pretend that it'll happen anytime soon. Lord Patten was most certainly right. We're not going to be divided by what happens in the near future. We are already divided and deeply divided. And I know that I can't be reconciled to an atavistic nationalism which some Brexiteers express. And I know full well that they can't be reconciled to my instinct for internationalism and modernity. The much-researched social divisions in the United Kingdom may not be reconciled for a generation or more, and certainly not by clustering around the unacceptable proposals of the Prime Minister. She has never grasped what is involved in reaching out in a mature manner to all sides of her own Parliament. The fault line between embedded nationalism and a modern social democracy shouldn't surprise us. It's visible in the United Kingdom, many parts of Europe, in the United States. It has constituted the basis for turmoil in Europe for centuries. It's never gone away. Victories for nationalists have scarred Europe more than any other experience, and yet we never seem to fully learn from these disasters. Where institutions build peace and security, we still seem to pull towards chaos and crisis. And the nationalistic populism still has broad appeal, especially when it's focused on foreigners, on people who are not like us, people to blame for a failing economy, leaving people and institutions struggling, on austerity, on feeling humiliated. These sentiments have to be addressed fully and properly. When was our politics more toxic? The miserable negativity of the Remain campaign, the mind-staggering mendacity of the Leave campaign and its funders, and the brutality of the language which is now common. Have we ever really known it worse? And I can't be reconciled to that kind of worldview. Brexit isn't the cause, of course, but Brexit picked the scab open. Hate crime, xenophobia, rhetoric about the citizens of nowhere, the hostile environment for people who wish to live here make us an uglier society by the day. Across the street from us, fascists screaming at MPs. I can't speak at first hand of the place where either of our archbishops celebrate their religion, but I ask what has happened when my place of worship has to be surrounded continually by large numbers of guards. Is that what we are now to live with? So I would rather face the struggle with nationalism, because I don't believe we can run away from it, but I offer a sincere challenge to those who say that conciliation is possible. I think a similar point was made by Lord Russell of Liverpool. It's plain that the Prime Minister has not until the last days tried to reach out to others and then mainly tried to frighten them. Nor has the leader of my party reached out to anyone. Our calamity has not found our Churchill and Attlee. We don't seem that grown up. Perhaps someone with the moral authority to do so can take the kind of approach that, say, Desmond Tutu took, to try to convene urgently an effort to find common ground, hopefully with the broader and more deliberative discussion that my noble friend Lady Armstrong advocated earlier, between crashing out and rebuilding a decent, United Kingdom. There's little time. I see no signs of the Commons front bench doing it. And the Archbishop should be asked, and were he here, and maybe I'll ask the Archbishop of York instead, are they up to the challenge of reconciliation, not just calling for it? I support my noble friend's amendment in these critical circumstances. It recognises the dangerous shortcomings in our security profile, which my noble friend Lord Brown warned us of on Wednesday. An astonishing position for a permanent member of the Security Council to find themselves in as a nation. There must be a moment when the weight of economic and commercial evidence is acknowledged by Brexiteers, but I note that Jacob Rees-Mogg on the 16th of December said that crashing out will boost the UK's economy by more than £1.1 trillion. What world is he in? Well, goodness knows in his case. I've gone back over the last major rounds of European venture finance decisions, the sort of things which business people do study to see which way the investment wind is blowing. It's a discouraging picture. Only one of the top 10 capital raises was in the United Kingdom, and there's an equivalent picture which is ugly for higher education and culture, as others have said. So I don't buy shares in the crash-out sunny uplands myth which is peddled by the hard right. Those saying it, except perhaps Lord Lilly, can't truly believe it either. Mr Rees-Mogg and his colleagues, of course, want to convince us that we will enjoy a soft landing. What they always omit to tell us is what we'll be landing in. And what worries me most, and I conclude on this point, is the failure to focus on the prospects of young people who took no part in the decision and have been ignored by Jeremy Corbyn, among others. In general elections every few years, they do have a say. Nothing is set in stone. And here we are, trying to bind them more or less indefinitely into a decision which, on all the evidence, shows they abhor it. Few mistakes, my lords, are more dishonourable than damaging the future of our children and their children. We will rely on them as the architects of the future. Let's give them a decent start.
Yeah. My lords, I was never very good at maths, but I think I'm probably Speaker 237 on this subject, if we take the debates before Christmas into account. Therefore, the chances that I can say anything original which hasn't better been put by somebody else are slight. There are three things, though, that I want to say. The first is about science, amplifying what my noble friend Lord Stern said earlier this afternoon. I declare an interest as chair of the Wellcome Trust. Science done in the UK, note I put it like that, I don't say UK science, I say science done in the UK, is critical for our economy. It delivers 25% profit in perpetuity on every pound invested. It's key, as Lord Krebs said before Christmas, for addressing our medical, our societal and other problems, environmental included. It's a fundamental part of this government's industrial strategy. And science depends totally on international collaboration, and the easy movement of researchers is vital to that, as Lady Thornton and Lady Masham spoke earlier. I've visited many labs in the United Kingdom, and I'm extremely excited by some of the science that's being done there. I have never been into a lab that was only staffed by British citizens. There are citizens from all over the world, but many from Europe are leaving, and others are not coming. At the Sanger Institute in Cambridge, which is probably at the moment, it may not go on being, the world's leading genomics institute, discovering on a weekly basis genetic causes of disease, has seen a 50% drop in those from Europe wanting to come and work in that institute. Why? They feel unwelcome. In the narrowly nationalistic country we risk becoming. I fear the gradual diminution and weakening of our science, and that concern is shared by all of the scientists I have spoken to. And that fear will increase in the event of no deal. Wellcome currently spends about £1 billion a year, mainly here, on medical research. To the extent that we are a major supporter of science done in the UK, and I should also add, we fund in 70 other countries, we are a major supporter here. But that support is not unconditional. If the excellence of science here diminishes, and we will do our best to try and prevent that happening, it's not an outcome any of us would want, we shall invest elsewhere. You might expect that the next subject I'm going to move on to is security. Now, the intelligence work of my former colleagues in MI5, MI6 and GCHQ and similar and comparable European organisations is actually outside the treaties, and I believe will always remain so. No nation is willing to contemplate delegating to the EU such critical powers. Indeed, suggestions that they should are usually rebuffed by our partners. It has never been the case, as one current cabinet minister asserted in the run-up to the referendum, that the EU determines who we share intelligence with and with whom. That's a national decision. So this is nonsense. As I'm afraid is the suggestion made last week that the withdrawal agreement and the political framework somehow jeopardises our national security by putting it under EU control. The words don't say that, and it would be completely against the tradition of the last 30 or 40 years. Also, that it will somehow upset the Five Eyes community. Actually, the Five Eyes community, which for in-house speak, I will remind the House, is the Americans, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, the Australians and ourselves, the English-speaking intelligence world. There are other groups, the European group, the Commonwealth group. But the Five Eyes community has always valued our link to the EU. Now, the threats we face are global, and we need the closest collaboration with all, not to have to choose between the Five Eyes and Europe. And I wish to acknowledge here our gratitude over many decades to the security intelligence services of Europe, who have given us unstinting help, saving British lives and working in close trust with us. We've always endeavoured to be generous in return, and I strongly endorse what Lord Ricketts said on this subject before Christmas. But security and intelligence are also integrated increasingly with police work. And what is a real concern to me is what would happen with no deal. In this area, as in science, Lord Brown of Ladyton laid out the issues, and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has been explicit about the dangers to our citizens if we leave the EU without a deal. Without addressing the effects of rupturing the links that bind us on security. For example, I will just refer to the European arrest warrant. Others have mentioned it. I also feel pretty queasy about the fact that Mr. Putin is so much in favour of what we're trying to do. Finally, language, as Lord Treesman mentioned. This matters as it creates an impression that no fine sentiments or lofty aspirations can dispel. We all deplore the abuse hurled on Palace Green at a member of the other place, but I have not forgotten, and am deeply ashamed of the fact, that our last Foreign Secretary compared the EU to Nazi Germany, while the current one chose instead of the Soviet Union, thereby insulting our long-standing friends, who are, many of them, also our closest allies in NATO, which was created after the collapse of Nazi Germany to address the threat from the Soviet Union. I've run out of time, my lords, but whatever the outcome tomorrow, and from what follows, I hope we will listen to the most reverend prelate and try to heal our nation. And to do that, let us stop abusing, let's stick to the arguments, let's stick to the reality and the evidence, not the myths, the lies and the magic.
My Lords, it was with some trepidation that, as one of my first actions on returning to the backbenches, I put my name forward for this debate. But my experience as a minister over 2 years, including leading on Brexit preparations for the Department of Health, have compelled me to speak for the merits of the Prime Minister's deal and to highlight the deep problems that exist, both with a no-deal outcome and remaining in the EU. Because at its heart, those are the three options before us, and that is how Parliament must choose. My Lords, on the 23rd of June 2016, I voted to leave the European Union because I do not believe it is in the long-term interest of this country to remain as a member. The Leave campaign, as we know, won that referendum, a decision that the two main parties pledged to honour, both at the time and in the subsequent 2017 general election, as my noble friend Lord Lansley reminded us. Having made that commitment, my lords, it followed that the UK would leave under one of two possible circumstances, either having struck a deal with the EU or with no deal in place. Parliament agreed with this logic, and by triggering Article 50 and subsequently passing the EU Withdrawal Act, Parliament made sure the default position is that we leave the EU on the 29th of March this year, deal or not. So throughout the last 2.5 years, I've been prepared to countenance leaving without a deal, as indeed should any parliamentarian who voted to honour the referendum result. And those now attempting to renege on their previous commitments by passing fatuous anti-no deal motions with no alternative in place are guilty of empty virtue signalling that would bring us no nearer a solution. However, it has become clear to me that there are very grave risks involved in leaving without a deal. It is absolutely right that the government continues to prepare for this eventuality. After all, Parliament has passed this outcome into law, and failing to fulfil that obligation would be unforgivable. But given the risk to continuing supply of essential goods on which our health and livelihoods rely, not project fear, but project reality, I cannot join those who positively support a no-deal outcome. It may yet happen, I hope not. But to blithely embrace this option without acknowledging the concrete short-term risks is reckless in the extreme. The second option, my lords, is that we remain in the European Union. The Prime Minister has outlined today the political ramifications of such a decision, which in my view would turn what has been a divisive but largely peaceful political process into something more sinister. But it is at least an honest and transparent policy, unlike the so-called People's Vote. There are such obvious and fatal practical problems with the proposal. What would the question be? How would the process work within the time available? I've asked many proponents and never received a straight answer. But these pale beside the profound flaws in this idea. First, the People's Vote is only supported by those who lost the first time round. It is precisely the kind of the people got it wrong, let's ask them again referendum that we used to rightly chastise our European neighbours for staging under pressure from the European Commission. My lords, it needs to be understood that proponents of the People's Vote are not interested in earnestly seeking the people's views in order to find a way forward. They only want a referendum so that voters can be told to stop being so stupid and agree, at last, with the so-called rational people who believe they know better. It would be more honourable if the People's Vote lobby just said what they really think. Hang the referendum. Let's just stay in. Second, are we honestly supposed to believe that if the answer came back again, leave, that proponents of a second referendum would accept this decision? Quite. If 17.4 million votes last time wasn't enough, why would next time be any different? People aren't stupid, and a second betrayal would be too much for our politics to bear. So, my lords, we come to our third option, the deal. Winston Churchill said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And I know that some colleagues apply a similar logic to the withdrawal agreement. I'm rather more positive about it, and this is why. In negotiating Brexit, the Prime Minister was tasked with achieving two seemingly opposing goals: ending the free movement of people while maintaining free and frictionless trade with the EU. And, my lords, this is precisely what she has done. Under the withdrawal agreement and political declaration, we will end free movement, end large and compulsory annual payments to the EU, leave the common agriculture and fisheries policies, and finally escape the Commission's relentless march towards political integration. And at the same time, we would maintain alignment with the EU on goods, critical to our consumers, including NHS patients, but a decreasing part of our own economy and future trade prospects. Critically, we keep open the Irish border, honouring the Belfast Agreement, boosting the Northern Irish economy, and keeping our union intact. And, my lords, if we were to move into the backstop after the transition period, this cherry-picked arrangement would become our ongoing relationship, and this is supposed to be a worst-case scenario. It is true, my lords, that the deal has its flaws, but the idea that there is a totally different deal out there to be had is the stuff of fantasy and unicorns. By reconciling the apparently irreconcilable, and in doing so forcing the Commission to pull apart its supposedly indivisible four freedoms, the Prime Minister has secured an historic agreement. It is now time for every parliamentarian who pledged to honour the referendum result in this House, but more importantly in the other place, to look to their conscience and support this deal.
I congratulate
Lord O'Shaughnessy on his very skillful speech. But speaking as the last opposition backbencher in this marathon debate, I hope the House will forgive me for a brief personal view of what has happened and where we are now. For me, the referendum result was a great blow. I'd been a committed European since I was 18, but what made the Remain defeat even harder to bear was the reaction of my grandchildren. One of them, and incidentally I have 10 grandchildren, one of them, with tears in his eyes and in words I shall never forget, cried out, "You do realise, Grandpa, that your generation has just ruined my life." Now, perhaps it was a bit over the top, but it made me determined to devote what was left of my political career to do what I could do to ensure the lives of my children and grandchildren's generations were not blighted by the referendum result. And my speech this evening is for them. Speaking in the first Lord's debate after the referendum, I accepted the result, but I argued that it was essential that Leavers and Remainers should get together to work out strategies that were in the national interest, and above all, to retain access to the markets of the EU. I also said that we should not trigger Article 50 until we worked out a proper plan. And I stressed the crucial role of Parliament in bringing the country together, which I believe was and is essential. Now, the new Prime Minister said that she saw her task as being to take the UK out of the EU. But the unanswered question, however, was how was she going to do it? Would Mrs May come down on the side of the hardline Brexiteers and go for a hugely risky hard Brexit, or would she decide to be a pragmatic national leader and reach out across party boundaries to pursue the best possible deal for the country? And let us not forget, the UK's recent prosperity has been based on our trade with other member states and the highly successful inward investment from outside the EU. And we shouldn't forget either that being a member of the EU has benefited the UK in a number of crucial ways, in improved and environmental and social protection, in research and education, in security and defence, and in our influence, the power and prestige in the world. The obvious Brexit strategy should therefore have been to mitigate the loss of these great advantages by remaining as close as possible to the EU. Instead, in her January 2017 Lancaster House speech, Mrs May took a disastrous, I believe, wrong turning. She laid down red lines which could have been lifted straight from a Brexiteer pamphlet. No single market, no customs union, no deal is better than a bad deal. By short-sightedly trying to please the Brexiteers, she made it almost impossible to arrive at a deal which was in the overall national interest. And overall, over the last 2.5 years since the referendum, Mrs May has twisted and turned as she has vainly attempted to reach a settlement with the EU, which was acceptable not just to business, but to the nation as a whole. First, we had the Chequers White Paper. Then, after that was rejected by the Brexit hardliners, we were presented with the withdrawal agreement and the political statement, which, of course, Parliament is now debating. It seems likely that despite Mrs May's undoubted persistence, of which we've seen the latest example this afternoon, her deal will be defeated in the Commons, partly because of the unacceptability of the Irish border backstop to the DUP and the hardline Brexiteers, and also because the agenda set out in the political declaration is too vague and would take years to negotiate. Now, if the withdrawal agreement is defeated tomorrow, it's anybody's guess what happens next. I believe that it would be an unmitigated disaster if the no deal, so enamoured by Brexiteers, and we've heard some of them this evening, was not also decisively voted down. The Leavers never told us that our motorways would be gridlocked and there'd be shortages of critical medicines and other essentials. The Leavers never told us that a no-deal Brexit would lead to a violent dislocation of virtually every legal agreement between the UK and the EU. So instead of a so-called smooth glide path into the new relationship of the continent, Britain would in fact be in free fall. Mrs May could, of course, try and seek other options, including further tweaks to her withdrawal deal, or at a last gasp going for something that she ought to have considered much earlier, the Norway Plus, for example. But these options suffer from disadvantages. Above all, the lack of time and the uncertainty of a parliamentary majority for them. There is, of course, a possibility of a general election, but it's far more likely that we will be forced, because there are no other real alternatives, into a second referendum. I'm aware of the possible dangers of a second referendum. We've heard some eloquent ones from the Archbishop. But if there's no parliamentary majority for any proposal, then it could be necessary to consult the voters again on the options, including remaining in the EU. And in order to make sufficient time for such a referendum, we should also have to ask for a delay in the implementation of Article 50. Now, none of us can predict the future, not even some of the clever people we've heard today. But I'm convinced that as time goes by, the difficulties of leaving the EU and the advantages of membership will become ever clearer. Above all, I'm convinced that generations of my children and grandchildren will not stand for an either disastrous no deal or a half-baked arrangement which will not only leave our country poorer, but also separate us off from our close continental neighbours who should be our natural partners. They will decide to remain a member of the Union, which has provided Europe with peace, stability and prosperity for the last 60 years. I support the amendment.
My Lords, I think we should be very proud for the last 3 days of this debate. I think there is no legislative assembly in the world that could have had such a debate as this, with such range and such variety, such knowledge and such eloquence, and all without rancour. And that should be a lesson to the other House, I may say. The House will have noted there are slightly different voices from the Conservative Party, and that is reflected by my friends on the front bench here. We've known each other for 20, 30, 40, in one case 50 years, and we have different views. And for them, in these debates, Lord Forsyth, Lord Lamont, Lord Lilly and Lord Hamilton made passionate speeches arguing for a no deal. And they're bemused that I can still support the May package. And I think the kinder ones of them think and hope that it's not early signs of senile dementia. But I have my memory, and I remember the debates in 1972 in the House of Commons. They were all about trade. It was about New Zealand and Australian butter and lamb and sugar from the Caribbean and exotic fruits from the ex-colonies. And we voted for a common market. We voted again for a common market in 1975. And the Europe of then and the Europe of now are two totally different communities. And the people who recognised that were the two best speakers in those debates, which were Michael Foot and Enoch Powell. And they forecast what would happen through the loss of sovereignty, our own sovereignty, the increasing powers of the centralising forces of Europe. And I realised that when I became a minister in the Thatcher and Major years. And I went as Home Secretary to meet the other local ministers of justice. And we first got to know each other. We had to get their names right and their countries right, tried to remember at the next meeting who they were, but they often changed. We were birds of passage. Some got promoted, some got sacked, and in our case, one got arrested. And they were the body that was meant actually to control the power of the Commission. And the Commission sat at a great long table, always the same people, month after month, year after year. It was extraordinary. We never really managed to cope with them. We had a pretty motley crew of ministers of justice. The Irish Minister of Justice had to resign because he'd fiddled his election expenses. The Italian Minister of Justice went to jail for a massive fraud in Naples. And the Spanish Minister of Justice got the jackpot prize. He went to jail for murder. This did not entirely make me love Europe more. And for me, March the 29th is almost sacred, because it is the day when we don't have to bother anymore about the European Commission or the European Parliament or majority voting or being told by officials what to do from Europe. We gain then the power to make our own laws in our own way, in our own Parliament, for our own people, in our own country. We get back our constitutional sovereignty as an independent nation state. That's why I voted for Brexit. It was a political decision, as Lord Soley was talking about political and trade decisions. And I know, of course, that you don't get all your freedoms back in one day. We have freedoms on fishing and on agriculture and free movement, but not on trade. And I am glad we don't get trade in one day, because it will take at least 2 years or 3 years, or whatever happens in the other place. They will need a period of transition to negotiate a deal, and they will negotiate a deal. It is possible to do a deal on trade, provided both parties want it, and we will get a satisfactory deal. But we have to be patient and to wait. And times in all political lives, you have to be prepared to wait and be patient. It's quite difficult at times for politicians to be patient, and certainly the Brexiteers are not very patient, but they must learn to wait. Or as Milton said, well, I've forgotten what he said, but I'll remember when I've sat down, of course. But could I say first on no deal, there's clearly no majority in this House for no deal, and I don't believe there's a majority in this House, in the country for no deal, because the actual details around the no deal are problematical, very problematical indeed, and it was very evident in the speech of a strong Brexiteer, Lord Bridges, on our side, when he said, when there are so many unknown features around it, and the decision is of such magnitude, you cannot depend, in his words, on maybe and cross your fingers. And so I believe that, in fact, no deal will not happen. But I think something that might happen, and many lords in this debate have said it, that the date should be moved on from March the 29th to July the 1st. Never. I would personally oppose that, because I think it will be the end of Brexit. Because what will happen in those 3 months, the whole campaign for a second referendum will gather pace and will roar ahead. And I think that a second referendum would... Yes, I know. The party that is cheering this is the party that is falling in the opinion polls, but never mind. Never mind. But I would say this, that I think a second referendum would be bitterly divisive in our country, both politically and socially. And I think the campaign would be incredibly bitter, because one of the things we've learnt in Brexit is that in Brexit, civility is driven out of political debate and discourse. MPs get death threats. They get abused as they go to the House of Commons. There is venom and hatred back. And I think that a second referendum would be so passionate on both sides, it would almost be a civil war activity. And the one group that would win in a referendum is populism. Because the major parties would certainly divide, and populism would arise. And what will you have? You will enter into the dark age of populist politics. And I think that would be the consequence of a referendum in our country. And finally, could I say this to Boris and to Jacob, because they've barely been mentioned in this debate, but they're quite important people in this matter. And I would say to both Boris and Jacob, who have a sense of history, I would say to them, do reflect upon the fact that the liberties that we enjoy in this country, which make this country such a wonderful place to live in and a magnet for so many other people, did not arrive in one day, or in 1 week, or in 1 month, or in 1 year, or in 1 decade, or in 1 century. Some of them came creeping slow, but they had one characteristic difference. They had a start day when somebody in the past said, I want the right to vote, and someone said, I want the right to speak freely, and someone said, I want to have the right to march and protest, and another one said, I do not want to be arrested in the middle of the night. And so, in fact, these things come slowly. And finally, I would say, before I sit down, to both Jacob and to Boris, I would remind them what Oliver Goldsmith, the poet, said of their great hero Edmund Burke in the 18th century. He is their great hero, he is my great hero. And he said that Edmund Burke was too fond of the right to pursue the expedient. The Brexiteers are too fond of the right to pursue the expedient. And tonight, my lords, I shall be voting in the expedient lobby. It's not the most romantic lobby, but it is the only lobby that can secure Brexit for Britain. And I commend it to your lordship.
My lords, may I thank and congratulate Lord Baker for his wit and wisdom, but I cannot agree with his diagnosis. I'm disappointed that Baroness Smith's motion has the phrase no deal outcome must be rejected. The reality, as I see it, and has come out from many who've spoken today, is that the WTO arrangements facilitate the best outcome for Britain, where otherwise we are potentially in a dangerous and constitutional mess. We have a bad deal, a deal where we would remain under a rule taker under ECJ jurisdiction over large areas with no influence on drafting EU laws. We could not negotiate our own trade deals, and the deal also creates, as we're all well aware, unacceptable border problems in Ireland. Could I also commend in particular Lord Lilly's and Lord Bamford's recent contributions and express my agreement with what Viscount Ridley said this evening. Lord Lilly, as I think everyone knows, was Trade Industry Secretary involved in setting up a WTO, and I say to those that remain concerned about WTO deal, go and talk to Lord Lilly and get views of a professional as to what are and are not serious problems. He sees no fears in our operating under WTO and cites 30 reasons to embrace WTO. It would end uncertainty and provide a clean break. It would provide a safe haven for business and consumers, and moving to WTO also makes it easier to take up Tusk's Canadian-style free trade offer, under which we could control how we trade. In short, WTO is the correct and positive response to the referendum vote and to the position we now find ourselves in.
My Lords, normally I would try to reflect speeches from across the House in my winding up, but this evening I'm going to concentrate on Liberal Democrats. This is partly because the loss of our late colleague Lord Ashdown is much on our minds. Obviously the primary grief is felt by Jane and the family, but we too, his political family, are nothing short of devastated. We badly miss his voice. Tweets of Paddy's from 2 months ago remain online. I'm afraid they're not complimentary about the governing party. And so our beloved country is once again held to ransom by squabbles in the Tory party, which gives rats in a sack a bad name. The great unravelling begins. If you want a playbook for what next, look to the Tory civil wars of the Corn Laws in 1846. The fact is that, unlike Liberal Democrats, whose hallmark is openness to the world, Tories have long been split between international and insular tendencies, and that continues today. Some talk admittedly about global Britain, but that seems more about resurrecting the empire, or at least the Anglosphere, than a true spirit of international and multilateral cooperation. Modern Liberal Democrats can still subscribe to the words of radical Liberal Richard Cobden, who cited among the benefits of repeal of the Corn Laws that it would introduce, through mutually advantageous international trade, a new era of international fellowship and peace. That sentiment endures, both as the rationale for the European project after 1945 and in the DNA of the modern Liberal Democrat Party. No wonder the two are so well aligned. As my noble friend Lord Wallace of Saltaire said last week, a global Britain should be within, not against, a global Europe. Hence, one of Paddy's successors, my noble friend Lord Campbell of Pittenweem, insisted in this debate last Wednesday, I am passionate about remaining in the European Union. I venture to observe that I'm just as passionate about remaining as those who are passionate about leaving. I respect their passion, and in turn, I expect them to respect mine. Another previous leader, Joe Grimmond, in his book The Liberal Future, 60 years ago, wrote, Liberals dissented from the original decision not to take part in the iron and steel community. A liberal foreign policy towards Europe would be based on the firm belief that Britain is a leading part of Europe. But it was not just Liberals in our Liberal Democrat heritage who carried the flame for Europe. My noble friends, Lord Rogers of Corrybank and Lord Taverne, came via the Labour Party and the Social Democrats and reminded us in this debate how they were part of that brave contingent of 69 MPs who defied the Labour leadership and its three-line whip to vote to join the then European Community in 1971. And Lords Wrigglesworth and McNally, also once SDP, stressed internationalist principles too. They were led by Roy Jenkins, later our Liberal Democrat leader here in the Lords. In the epilogue to his European diary as President of the European Commission, Roy recounts the formation of the SDP, noting simply and unremarkably that the SDP and its alliance partner maintained a wholly committed European position. Roy Jenkins also harks back much further in our political roots, when in his biography of William Gladstone, he quotes from his Midlothian campaign, when Gladstone was much concerned about atrocities in the Balkans against Bulgarians and Montenegrins. Gladstone, he records, spoke of a nation called to undertake a great and responsible duty in regard to the peace of Europe and the need for right and justice to be done. These are uncanny echoes of Paddy Ashdown's insistence that we had to take an interest in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s and take on a responsibility to protect, in particular, the Kosovars and Bosnians being subject to ethnic cleansing on our continent. In her very generous comments about Paddy Ashdown in her debate on the Western Balkans last Thursday, the noble Lady Baroness Hellich said, "During the Bosnian War in the 1990s, most politicians, including some from my own party, pontificated from a distance. Lord Ashdown went in and out of Sarajevo during the longest siege in modern history, across a risky mountain route and through a tunnel burrowed into the city." Hence, when my noble friend Lord Wallace of Saltaire wrote a slim penguin tome for the 1997 election called "Why Vote Liberal Democrats?" in words he could repeat today, he wrote, "Nostalgia for an imperial past combined with hostility to closer cooperation with Britain's neighbours offers no credible way forward. Liberal Democrats are internationalists by instinct and by intellectual conviction. We believe that Britain can achieve more through sharing sovereignty and pooling power than by standing alone. Britain is a European country. Our international interests and responsibilities start with our concern to promote peace, stability and prosperity within Europe, in partnership with our European neighbours." Another consistent theme of Liberal Democrats is social justice. My noble friend Lord Steele of Akewood, yet another former party leader, said in this debate, "In the light of the last referendum result, the government should pledge themselves to remedying the real grievances in parts of the country that have felt neglected over many years." While Paddy, in his book Beyond Westminster 25 years ago, observed how Britain, like now, actually was in a profoundly depressed and bewildered state, with a sense of hope that has died and a leadership that has failed, and a dangerous mood of fatalism, a loss of national self-confidence and even self-respect. That is why on these benches we insist not only that there is a better option than any kind of Brexit, which is to remain, but that British politicians should then turn our energies to remedying, through our domestic efforts, the grievances, the loss of hope, the anger at being neglected, which Brexit will make worse. We are outraged not only at the shabby treatment this Tory government is meting out to the 5 million EU and UK free movers, but to the extraordinary way the Prime Minister has trumpeted as her #1 achievement that free movement will end. She seems totally unable to appreciate that she is tearing away from Brits young and old one of the greatest benefits of the EU, the ability and freedom to move around Europe to work, study or retire. That is, unless they are rich enough to purchase residence or a passport in another EU country, as perhaps some in this House are. My Lords, Liberal Democrats make no bones about it. We hope that in a people's vote, a final say, the British people will choose to remain with all they know now 3 years on. This party, our predecessors, our leaders and our members are united in believing passionately, as we always have done, that nothing can be as good as EU membership. to hijack Martin Luther. We cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here we stand. We can do no other. And indeed, we can do no other than support the motion from the noble Lady Baroness Smith of Basildon.
My Lords, the motion in the name of my noble friend, the Baroness Smith, firstly acknowledges the Commons' responsibility for deciding whether the deal is ratified. A decision echoing that referred to of the 28th of October 1971, when the Commons, including our Lord Speaker and 19 other current members of your Lordship House, voted to enter the common market, albeit another 13 voted no. Our role, indeed our duty, says my noble friend Lady Ramsay, is to offer our advice, which is what we do today. Secondly, the motion rejects no deal. That inane slogan, no deal is better than a bad deal, was voiced before the Prime Minister understood what no deal meant. Well, we know now. Food and energy prices up, fresh produce down, even rationed, medicines fewer, though they're going to be safe in Matt Hancock's new fridges, ports jammed, manufacturing damaged, checks and delays making just-in-time supply chains clogged, as the government never listened to Toyota, Jaguar, Honda or Nissan. The economy, the pound down, perhaps the steepest slump since the war, the CBI warning of profound economic consequences with GDP cut 8%. Our security jeopardised, no deal having a real impact on the government's ability to protect the public, whilst virtually overnight 1 million UK citizens across the EU are suddenly in limbo. And to those who say we're crying wolf, may I remind them that that four-legged beast did turn up. No wonder the Civil Contingencies Secretariat briefed the Privy Council on no deal. ABI begs Parliament to avoid crashing out. The City of London says it would undermine financial stability, disrupting services to households and businesses on both sides of the Channel. And the Business Secretary labels it dire prospect, causing incalculable damage, even as his own government spends £80 million a week and redeploys 4,000 civil servants just to minimise the resulting disruption. So that is what would happen, but even more, even those who want to go out finally on WTO terms, no deal means doing that with no transition. So no deal must be emphatically rejected. The third arm of the motion regrets the agreement's damage to our prosperity, security and global influence. My Lords, the majority of the 240 speeches over 5 days voiced deep anxieties about a deal which even the Chancellor admits will make the country poorer. And as we've heard from the bishops' benches, a poverty borne largely by the poor. In relation to Northern Ireland, its shortcomings were exposed by my noble friends Lord Goldsmith and Lord Murphy and by the noble Lord Bew in December. Since then, just as we restarted this debate, the government issued 47 new paragraphs on Northern Ireland, evidence of their absence from the agreement itself. And the document raises problems, not just because it requires primary legislation, in addition to the 7 other bills that we have to do before exit, but because, as the Prime Minister said today, the Assembly could have a seat at the table on the joint committee, but she made no mention of the same for Wales or Scotland. Interestingly, the document gives the Assembly a right to consultation on extending the transition, but it's far from clear that this Parliament would have a role in approving any such extension, as we were warned by our EU committee. We might also note that the Joint Committee's decisions, despite having the same legal status as the withdrawal agreement and being able to amend the withdrawal agreement, require no parliamentary approval. Meanwhile, as my noble friend Lord Griffiths noted, there is no mention of Wales or Scotland at all in the agreement, and nothing about improving the joint ministerial arrangements dealing with powers being repatriated to devolved administrations. So it's no wonder that the Welsh Assembly rejected the deal and asked the Lord Speaker to make it known to this House. Most seriously, perhaps, the political declaration is dismally inadequate as the architecture for our future relationship. It really is Lord Bridges' gangplank into thin air. It fails to foster trade and prosperity through a permanent customs union, even ruling this out by restating that independent trade policy red line. It ignores our wealth-generating services, the legal, accounting, financial, education, and creative sectors. It fails to guarantee environmental, food safety, employment, or consumer protection, while the loss of EU workers threatens food production, health and social care, SMEs, the cash-strapped startups, and, of course, young people. With a £30,000 threshold for entry, confusing pay rates with skill, whereas, as the noble Lady Bull, who knows a thing or two about talent, said, salary levels are not a proxy for skills. Furthermore, the framework's lack of certainty means businesses cannot now begin to adjust to an unknown landing place, while the absence of assurances on civil jurisdiction leaves companies unable to plan for continued EU activity because, as the noble and learned Lord Thomas of Cumgeath warned, cross-EU civil enforcement would end. Meanwhile, there'd be weakened ability to use EU competition law when cartels are taking advantage of us, and there's nothing about staying in the EU Intellectual Property Office, meaning trademark protection would have to be duplicated. The mere 26 pages offer little comfort to services, including financial services, some 10 to 15% of our GDP, where exports to the EU could halve. Science, scholarship, medical advances, we've heard these from the noble Lord Krebs, my noble friend Baroness Thornton, and now from Baroness Mannington-Buller, that all of these will be undermined in the plans that appear before us. Accounting, auditing, design, education, culture, business, legal services, all just cast adrift. Worse, perhaps, is what the framework allows. Without a guarantee of being in a customs union with a strong single market relationship, there'd be no stopping the PM continuing to appease her ERG minority with all the collateral damage described by the noble Lord Patten. My lords, the framework should be more than just a bucket list, because Article 184 of the agreement requires the parties to negotiate an agreement in line with the political declaration. So what's in it matters, but it doesn't provide confidence regarding our continuation of trading, diplomatic, security or cultural links with our close allies, our near neighbours and our long-term friends. It's written to favour trade deals with third countries, a mythical future ignoring the protectionist American first tendencies of the US president. The PM wasted 2 years negotiating with her own party. She put blinkered Brexiteers in charge who rejected all evidence at variance with their ideological obsession. Labour's alternative, and we have spelt it out, is a customs union. Shall we say it again? It's a customs union. It's been on offer, and had it not been ruled out by that short-sighted red line, we might indeed have been talking about it. The government claims the deal would protect security, but outside of the European arrest warrant and intelligence exchange, this is simply not the case, as the head of the Met has warned. My Lords, these are serious, precarious times, as storm clouds gather, as the noble Lord King described. But this deal, with its dangers for our economy, security and international relations, will lessen our voice in that troubled world as we face the US antics, climate change, international security. We know the list. The deal jeopardizes our security and economy. That might keep the Tories out of office, as the noble Lord Heseltine warned us in December, but that's little comfort, not just because Labour would have to rebuild the economy, but because of the damage to public trust in democracy, especially amongst Leave voters who genuinely believe Brexit would improve, not damage their families' lives and futures, as my noble friend Lord Little suggested. The deal fails to unite the country, and that's the result of the government's refusal to engage with the 48%, the trade unions, business, consumers, Parliament, or the opposition. My Lords, the duty of the Commons, as my noble friend Lord Brennan said, is to direct the government. The noble and learned Lord Mackay of Clashfern, agreed. If this deal is not accepted, the question of what to do next is for Parliament to answer. Actually, he went on, if Parliament can't solve this, let's call the whole thing off and propose a motion we stay in the European Union. That other dangerous radical, Lord Armstrong of Ilminster, similarly suggested that if the agreement is defeated, the Prime Minister should, without further delay, revoke the notice of withdrawal. My Lords, this evening it is in the national interest for us to say that the deal is not acceptable for the future of our country. Even those who've given it their begrudging support describe it as imperfect, least worst, least bad option. Well, that's not sufficient for my grandchildren, your grandchildren, or my noble friend Lord Radich's grandchildren. Hence our motion, no to no deal, and this deal will not do. I urge the House to support the motion to be moved by my noble friend Baroness Smith.
My Lords, I'm pleased to close this debate on behalf of the Government, and I thank noble Lords on all sides of the House for their contributions to this debate. And I think it is a mark of the role of this House that even at this hour the House is in its present form and so full as we conclude what is such an important debate on such a fundamentally important issue. Trust and compromise. If we don't trust those with whom we engage, then there really can never be room for compromise. If we have no means to compromise, then we will find it impossible to achieve consensus. Trust and compromise. Now, I am not a supporter of the idea of referenda. Like the noble Lord Stevens, I experienced at first hand the referendum on Scottish independence. It was attended by division, exaggeration, overstatement, and immediately followed by demands for a second referendum that have persisted ever since. But this Parliament decided that the question of whether or not we remain or leave the EU should be put to a referendum. No one forced them to do that. They passed an act for the referendum by an overwhelming majority. And they didn't concern themselves overly at the time with the precise terms in which they were going to put that to the people. They were simply determined that it would go to the people. And then they went to the people in a general election. And both principal parties put it forefront in their manifestos that they would respect the result of the referendum. Yeah. And thereafter, this Parliament passed an act to authorise the executive to serve the Article 50 notice, which under international law would determine our membership of the European Union. And then this Parliament passed the European Union Withdrawal Act that defined the exit date for us to leave the European Union as 29th March 2019. So it was this Parliament which determined, both at the level of international law and in domestic law, that our exit from the European Union would take place on that date. And there followed 2 years of negotiations. And in some places, I hear those negotiations belittled. They were carried out by officials working to their instructions and performing to the best of their abilities. And perhaps some would be prepared to acknowledge that, whatever the outcome of their actual negotiation. But without the withdrawal agreement, I simply remind noble lords that we do, under the law that this Parliament made and implemented, leave the European Union on 29th March of this year. And that should be at the forefront of everyone's minds. Now, we've had reference to alternatives, mention of Labour's 6 points. I was going to refer again, of course, to the lucid explanation of those points given by the Honourable Member for Brent, Mr. Barry Gardiner, who is still the front bench spokesman for Labour on the matter of trade. But I don't think I really need to repeat it. And indeed, the noble Lord Liddell gave a very adequate summary of Labour's position on this. I would merely mention that the noble lady, Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town, alluded to a customs union, which, as described by Labour, would be directly contrary to Article 1 of the Treaty of Rome, and would also effectively confer upon the United Kingdom, were the EU ever to accept it, a veto over the EU entering into free trade agreements with third-party countries. It is admirable in its breadth, but hopeless in its intent. Now, of course, the Liberal Democrat Party did not go into the general election with a mandate to respect the outcome of the referendum. And their position, as I understand it, is that they are determined to keep the United Kingdom in the European Union by any legitimate means. And I see them acknowledge that, and I understand it. Legitimate means and democratic means, let us put it that way. Now, of course, they went to the country in the general election as well, and they returned with 12 seats in the House of Commons. The Scottish Conservatives returned with 13 seats in Scotland, a part of the United Kingdom that voted to remain. But then perhaps people had intelligently understood that the outcome of the referendum should be respected, and that they should support those who were prepared to respect it. We see reference to a second referendum. It would be seen by many as a constitutional outrage. The United Kingdom voted by a majority of about 1 million people to leave the EU. And the noble Lord Grocott touched upon this point. People such as myself from north of Watford do understand the meaning of the word leave. It's not a factual question, it's more philosophical. Now, their reasons for voting leave cover a spectrum from the sublime to the ridiculous, from the laudable to the laughable. But it was this Parliament which decided that that was how the issue should be determined. So look to yourselves. A democratic decision can be reversed. If you choose a party in a general election, you may decide that you're not entirely impressed by them and have a second general election and decide on a new party of government. And I hear the noble Lady Baroness Chakrabarty saying it's a good idea, but of course it has no comparison with the present situation where we want to reverse the decision in a referendum when it has never even been implemented. And that is why people would regard that as something of an outrage. As the noble Lord, my noble friend Lord O'Shaughnessy observed, there are issues about the call for a second referendum. And indeed, many people would regard it as a charade. Because those calling for it, or at least many of those calling for it, don't want the people to decide. They want the people to give them what they regard as the correct answer, because they didn't give it last time. And there is no reason why they wouldn't ignore a second leave vote just as readily as they ignored the first leave vote. Of course, they seek to dress it up as the, quote, people's vote, unquote. Who do they believe voted in the first referendum? Yeah. Sheep? It was the people's vote. Now, let me come back to the issue of trust. We have the withdrawal agreement and the backstop, which are and are intended to be temporary means for us to actually exit the European Union and do not, by themselves, determine our future relationship. That is outlined in the political declaration. Now, if we don't trust the party with whom we are engaging, then all forms of agreement and negotiation are simply worthless. At the level of international law, you cannot, short of war or gunboat diplomacy, force a nation or an international body to implement a promise or obligation if it decides not to do so. Whether it's an oral promise, a written assurance, a solemn undertaking, an international treaty, or something written in blood on vellum, if they're determined to lie to you, to mislead you, to change their minds, you're simply going nowhere. And we hear references to the EU wishing to punish us, wishing to put us into a triple lock, wishing to hold the backstop in perpetuity. And yet the European Union say entirely candidly that they want a fruitful future economic, security and social relationship with the United Kingdom. Yeah. So why would they want to punish us? They don't want to enter a backstop, and if they do, they wish to do so for the shortest time possible. Nobody appears to have acknowledged that, in fact, great advances were made in negotiations so far as the backstop is concerned. It was proposed originally for Northern Ireland alone, and that would have had the most profound consequences for our constitutional situation in the United Kingdom. But that is no longer the case. It embraces the entirety of the United Kingdom, and by doing so, it breaks the four freedoms that the European Union said would never be broken, and it does produce the very cherry-picking that they said they would never contemplate. In addition, the European Union has made it clear that they want to implement the terms of the political declaration as soon as possible. Well, if we don't believe them, we should stop now. But if we do trust them, then we can place faith in these expressions, whether in a formal treaty, a written declaration, or correspondence from the President of the Commission and the President of the Council. If we trust the integrity of our interlocutors, we may better understand the motives of those with whom we negotiate and the extent to which they are truly willing to compromise. We often see the European Union as concerned with economics, social policy and politics, but in reality, I suspect that they consider their priorities to be political, social and economic. And that is one reason why so many people in the United Kingdom chose to leave. They were against the notion that underpins even the original Treaty of Rome of ever closer political union. The withdrawal agreement and the political declaration have to be read together and in good faith. We have to trust the promises that are made in good faith and understand the need for compromise on both sides. And looking to ourselves, we perhaps need to remind ourselves that the referendum was not a choice between good and evil, or between ruin and redemption. My noble friend Lord Forsyth of Drumlene suggested at one point that the Most Reverend Primate, the Archbishop of Canterbury, had implied that all those who voted leave would go to hell. I don't believe he suggested any such thing.
I suggested no such thing.
Well, that was my understanding, and I apologise if he suggested. Well, I certainly don't believe the Most Reverend grade. And I was going to say, even if the Most Reverend Primate had even contemplated such a thing, he would have left room for repentance. My lords, if we can again trust and comprehend the art of compromise, then we can tell the other place that the time has come where the alternatives are worse. We must respect the decision of the people given in the referendum, and we must proceed with the withdrawal agreement. Touching upon some of the observations that were made during the course of this debate, the noble and learned Lord Thomas referred to the attempts to secure mutual recognition in the context of judicial issues, and I acknowledge that steps are taken to achieve that and that it has not yet been achieved. The noble Baroness Thornton referred to the idea of participation in European Union programmes going forward, and that is something that's reflected in the political declaration. And the noble Earl of Clancarty, and indeed the noble Lady Baroness Manningham-Buller, talked about the need for reciprocal mobility in the areas of science and research. And again, these are matters that will be the subject of negotiation going forward. The withdrawal agreement is our means of leaving the EU. It is not the determination of our future relationship. And that is why in the context of, for example, the future of services, and in particular financial services, the political declaration includes commitments to cooperation on regulatory and supervisory matters. And in relation to security, the noble Lady Baroness Manningham-Buller pointed out how that is preserved going forward, albeit there is the issue of police cooperation, which is so important, but which is maintained beyond the EU by reciprocal arrangements. For example, in the case of Norway and Iceland, who are not within the EU, but still are able to maintain the sort of relationship that we would intend to have going forward. So in all these areas, we are able, going forward, to contemplate a partnership with the European Union that will reflect our standards, our concerns, our security, and our common interest in these areas. Can I come on, though, to the motion that has been moved by the noble Lady Baroness Smith? To be moved by the noble Lady Baroness Smith. Well, I do, in a sense, I agree. Before I just come to that, the noble Lady Baroness Hayter of Kentish Town touched upon the motion, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But in doing so, she also wanted to refer to the fact that in recent times we've seen a devaluation in the pound, which is without precedent since the war. I think she'll find, she mentioned the war, but I think she'll find that Harold Wilson, with Dennis Healey as his Chancellor, devalued the pound-dollar rate from 4 to 2.8. which is rather more severe than anything we've experienced in the recent past. Now, can I come on? Can I come on? No, with respect, I think if you check the timings, I'm within my time, but if I'm without, I'm going to make an observation about the motion. Can I come on to the matter of the motion, and in particular the third part of the motion, which is in these terms, and I remind noble lords of the terms because it is important. It regrets that withdrawal from the European Union on the terms set out in the withdrawal agreement and political declaration laid before Parliament would damage the future economic prosperity, internal security and global influence of the United Kingdom. Now, of course, it has been most carefully drafted by the noble Baroness, and the ambiguity inherent in it is no doubt deliberate. Because we have a situation in which some noble lords take that third part of the motion and say, well, I think that the withdrawal agreement is less than it should be. I believe the withdrawal agreement is not perfect, and therefore I can support this part of the motion, but of course I do believe that the withdrawal agreement should be approved in the other place because it is the sensible way for us to go forward and leave the European Union. And there are those of your noble lordships who have indicated that is their understanding of the third part of the motion. And yet there are others, and I note the noble Lord McNally is one of them, who take that third part of the motion to say the withdrawal agreement is damaging in the following ways, and as a consequence, I do not support the idea that the House of Commons should approve it. So what we have built into the third part of this motion is a clear ambiguity, and what we really want to send to the House of Commons is a view about what they should do with the withdrawal agreement, not the result of an ambiguous motion, which would draw some people into approving it because they believe the withdrawal agreement should not be approved, and others to say the withdrawal agreement is less than perfect, but should be. And I ask all noble lords to consider whether they want to be a party to such an ambiguous statement. And it's in these circumstances that I thank noble lordships for their attention and invite them to consider carefully whether they are prepared in these circumstances to approve the motion that's about to be moved.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, I put this again. The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content, the contrary not content, the contents have it.
Baroness Smith of Basildon.
My Lords, we've had a long debate and I don't think there's any appetite for further debate. My motion as it stands on the order paper and the 3 points is very clear. I beg to move.
The question is that the motion in the name of Baroness Smith of Basildon be agreed to. As many of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. Not content. Clear the bar.